Chapter 1494. Published at 27th of December 2022, 8:44 and 59 seconds AM. Chapter 1494. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Bonus chapter for 3,750 golden tickets. Next at 5250. You want to buy a property next to a Senate branch? Dmitri looked at Lionel and Anna again. Was it possible for these two to do something a bit more normal? Even in the weakest areas frequented only by quadrant-ranked disciples cost tens of millions. And, most of them were controlled by level 7 galaxy-ranked disciples at the worst. The location was simply too valuable. Even if there were only low-ranked disciples around, the amount you would make would accumulate pretty quickly so long as your service was decent. Even for a top-tier galaxy-ranked disciple, just the sheer volume would be able to total into a nice sum by the end of the month. Usually, after buying such a location, you'd be able to make your money back in about half a year to a year, and that was just the average. If you became popular, you'd be far faster. So, one can imagine the kind of money large factions with entire territories to themselves were raking in. I believe that we should be able to challenge a landowner for their spot, correct? Lionel asked to confirm, ignoring Dmitri's shock. In truth, he, of course, already knew the answer to this question. It was just that he would need to get the right to challenge permit from Dmitri as well. Luckily, the permit was much less expensive, just a single merit and 100,000 points. It was just a high enough bar that most wouldn't dare to casually use it. After all, you couldn't just allow one to randomly challenge as they pleased. If such a thing was fine, then wouldn't a store owner never get any rest? This price, though, was only for someone challenging a store owner above their rank. The price increased exponentially the higher rank you were in comparison to your target. In this way, the Void Palace maintained some of its fairness as well. All right. I'm already tired of questioning the two of you anyway. Just do what you want, so long as you don't break the rules. Dmitri began preparing the permit before he suddenly thought of something. Shouldn't you apply for galaxy rank now? The requirements for reaching galaxy rank from level 9 quadrant rank were pretty straightforward. Lionel had already covered most of it. He had already gathered more than enough combat merits, the part most people found the hardest. Now, he just needed to complete the two other requirements. The first was to accumulate what was called civilian merits, and the second was to break into the 6th dimension using the God Path. Civilian merits were merits gained through non-combat means. They could refer to contributing to research, joining a secondary profession faction, and completing a certain list of tasks, or it could be something as simple as starting a storefront and accumulating points through it. So long as you could gain one void merit through any of these processes, you could be considered to have reached the mark. The combat merits were harder as you needed to accumulate 10 million void points, 10 void merits, and you also needed to complete at least one galaxy-ranked mission as well. As for the second requirement, it didn't need an explanation. I'm not quite ready yet. Lionel grinned. Why should he be in a rush? There were benefits to being low-ranked as well, even if they weren't as excellent as being unranked. Plus, he hadn't quite met all the requirements yet. He was still in tier 6 of the 5th dimension, and he was still a bit away from earning a civilian merit. That said, Lionel wasn't very worried about his tier. With the increase to his comprehension of his Scarlet Star Force, he could break through to the quasi-6th dimension and form his final star whenever he wanted, just like how he had relied on it previously. The only reason he hadn't was because, first, he had been focused on other things, and secondly, he had still yet to fully grasp the visualization of. All this time, he had been relying on his innate node to break the shackles of his mind and not as he was meant to. If he didn't comprehend it first, it would be more difficult to do so later and he wouldn't be able to pass down the pieces of to his friends and brothers like he wanted to. With Lionel's current strength of mind, though, he didn't believe that this would be any sort of big trouble to him at all. Following that, he would still have to learn about the God Path as well. All in all, Lionel wasn't in a rush. He couldn't leave the Void Palace anyway, and there was nothing pressing for his time outside of the coming air wars. He could afford to lay his foundation more stably. Dmitri shook his head and handed the permit over. Try not to destroy too much. And this time, please don't hang naked bodies outside of my branch again. At the very least, not half-castrated bodies. Lionel laughed, but Dmitri couldn't help but notice that he didn't make any promises. Lionel and Aina left the Senate branch and made a straight line toward their next destination. It was clear that they already had in mind exactly what they wanted. There wasn't any slight hesitation in their steps. Soon, they stopped in front of a building. This plot of land would cost 40 million, at least double the price of the cheapest near Senate locations. However, Lionel still chose it not because of its nicer locale, but rather because of who owned it. Without a word, Lionel pressed his fore and middle finger together, his fingers piercing forward in a swift slash. Those that had smelt trouble had already backed away, beginning to spectate from a safe distance. However, even they were shocked when they saw the green thread banner and signboard being split in two. The sign rattled to the ground beneath the deafening silence. Just because they were licking their wounds, didn't mean that Lionel had to let them. Chapter 1495. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:44 and 59 seconds AM. Chapter 1495. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. That's it? Aina asked. Just the sign. Lionel chuckled. There's a perfectly good building right here. If we destroy it, wouldn't we have to build a new one? Well, just have to thank Triana in advance. Aina shook her head. Sometimes she couldn't decide whether Lionel was charismatic, or the exact opposite. What kind of charismatic person was so good at pissing people off? She didn't even have any good emotions toward Triana, but she suddenly felt bad for her. By this point, Lionel had crippled so many of Triana's people that Aina wouldn't be surprised if most were too afraid to even help the Green Thread faction any longer. Then, he stripped 3 of her more powerful faction guardians naked and posted them up for everyone to see. And now, as though all of that wasn't enough, Lionel actually wanted to just snatch away one of their buildings? Although Aina had only been in one of Triana's hospitals, it was enough to know that their faction had spent quite a lot on aesthetics, and was especially particular about using materials that could keep anarchic force out. There was no doubt that the building itself was worth just as much as the ground it was built on, if not more. Aina had thought that Lionel would destroy it entirely, but who knew that he would actually be shameless enough to speak of just keeping it? I didn't know you could be so shameless. I'm still holding back, Lionel said proudly, as though he had been complimented. If I were to really go all out, would be on baby 3 by now. Aina didn't know what to say. How'd he manage to make this about baby making again? Did he not have anything else on his mind? They were about to enter a battle. As though Aina's thoughts were some kind of cue, the doors of the treatment center burst open, 3 individuals charging out at once. It was clear that the commotion of their sign being split in 2 and falling to the ground wasn't small, even alerting so many. When they saw that it was Lionel and Aina across from them, their expressions changed. By now, who of the Green Thread faction wouldn't have heard of these 2? Lionel didn't wait, holding up the permit he had just purchased. I'll be challenging your storefront today. His words were simple and didn't carry the same smiling expression he had had for Aina at all. However, they alone were enough for the accumulating crowd to react as though a bucket of water had been thrown into hot oil. The expression of the green-haired young man leading the group changed before becoming nasty. Why was it that lots of land near Senate branches were so valuable? One of the reasons was the safety inherent to the region. Fighting within a Senate branch was prohibited, and most subconsciously stretched out that range to the general vicinity of the branch as well. However, Lionel was clearly not a person with such qualms. It was clear Lionel believed that their faction was one he could just casually bully whenever he wanted. Many had already acknowledged his strength, and it was fair enough that it could be said that their faction had started things, but did he think that he could be so casual with challenging them? Lionel had spent a year in seclusion, and he had only just entered the Void Palace, so how could he know about the trials and tribulations their faction had already undergone? The Vierer family was nowhere near as strong as the Morales family, to begin with, nor could it compare to the Constellation families, or those other noble families that ran big-shot organizations like Shield Cross Stars or the Force Crafters Guild. And yet, despite not having such a background, they had managed to carve out a monopoly for themselves on the backs of not just their hard work, but the talent of their future matriarch, Triana. As badly as Lionel and Aina thought they had been bullied by their faction, when they had just started off, they had faced far worse. So, from their point of view, Lionel and Aina were overestimating themselves. At least back then, Triana still had the backing of her faction. But right here, there were only these two. Did they think that they were enough? The young man stormed forward, a heavy black chain appearing in his hands. Without waiting for another word, he flicked his wrists, causing it surge forward like a tide. The shadows of the chain seemed to block all lanes of retreat. The attack was swift and powerful, but flexible and subtle at the same time. Lionel had rarely fought chain and whip experts in the past, but there was no doubt that this young man was the most skilled he had ever seen. His hands shook, and one of his fingers flexed as spear force accumulated. He was just about to pierce forward when Aina grabbed his wrist. "I let you have all the fun last time because you were angry, but this time it's my fault. Do you think you're the only one with a temper?" Aina glared at Lionel before ignoring him entirely and sending out a punch. In that moment, what sounded like a clap of thunder shattered the snaking shadows, revealing the image of the main whip, only for it to collide with Aina's fist. Compared to the heft of the chain, Aina's slender arm and small fist really looked too frail. And yet, it was exactly this frail punch that stopped the chain in its place, sending a surge of energy through its body and causing the wrist of the young man controlling it to break. A shriek of horror sounded, but Aina had already vanished from her spot, her foot lightly tapping the ground as a rush of crimson fog enveloped her. Lionel seemed to realize at that moment that Aina hadn't just improved a little bit, she was now in the quasi-sixth dimension, and her strength showed it. Chapter 1496. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:45 a.m. Chapter 1496. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The three that had come fell one after another, unable to last even a few exchanges with Aina. They writhed on the ground, their bodies aching with pain. Back then, Aina had only allowed Lionel to fight on her behalf because she quite liked the feeling of him protecting her. So long as it wasn't a life or death situation, he didn't mind being a docile partner to his right. However, as much as she liked that, she also liked fighting, and she could sense a powerful opponent inside. If she didn't claim this battle for herself and let Lionel attack first, she wouldn't even get the chance to regret it later. When Lionel started fighting, he forgot about everything else. Sometimes he looked like even more of a battle maniac than she was. The three youths that had fallen to the ground were unable to get up. Aina's fighting style didn't seem as wild or murderous as Lionel's, but only they knew well that Aina was maybe even more vicious. Lionel might rip out an arm, but Aina's offensive seemed to make sure that they'd have broken bones and leaking inner organs in the worst of places. They couldn't even breathe without feeling as though shards of glass were lodged in their lungs. At that moment, the very figure Aina had been waiting for walked out. The young lady was wrapped in what looked like green leather armor that clung tightly to her curves. Vines, flowers, and even the occasional patch of bark decorated her armor, making it difficult to tell if it was real leather at all, or if it was just a special sort of plant. Lionel knew who this young woman was quite immediately. Of course, this wasn't by her name or her feats, but rather the role she played. The thoughts of the three youths that had charged out initially were not wrong. The Green Thread faction had, indeed, gone through a lot to reach its current level. As such, they had many policies in place to protect themselves, policies that Lionel was mostly familiar with due to his buying of information. Every one of Triana's properties was protected by a powerhouse. These powerhouses were the core of the Vierer family's strength in this generation. Triana might have been the best, but she had others of her age chase after her footsteps, some more powerful than others. One of these so-called powerhouses was Rosamond, whom Lionel had had a run-in with. This lady here was clearly another one. She was only in Tier 3 of the 6th dimension, but despite this, her presence made Emily, Elliot, and Jova, who had all been in Tier 4, seem like small tides on a slow day. It was clear that in the Void Palace, Tier was the very last measurement you should use to gauge someone's strength. Underestimating someone because their tier was low could very well cause you to suffer greatly. There was no doubt that this woman was either very close or already within the 97th percentile, having taken around 5 years or less to rise from nominal disciple to galaxy-ranked disciple. Seeing the state of her 3 family members, the young woman frowned before her gaze locked onto Aina. The 2 women moved at once. The young woman in green leather and bits and pieces of nature flipped a palm to reveal an emerald green whip. At the same time, Aina's spatial ring trembled, revealing a long, snaking silk scarf that curled above her arms, following them up her shoulder and around the back of her neck. Aina looked like she had just worn a shawl, but it was clear at a glance that it didn't touch her. Whip and cloth shot out, however, when they met. Instead of hearing the sounds of a cracking whip, there was only a gentle and reserved thud. The 2 women floated about with an eye-aching speed, their 2 styles seemingly completely different. The young woman's whip was fast, harsh and straight to the point. But Aina's silk cloth seemed to flow softly and slowly, redirecting all the strength it faced without the slightest hurry. This seemed to paint the illusion that Aina was having a simple time, but Lionel's gaze remained narrowed. Their fighting styles were different, but they were still about equal. Of course, the young woman had yet to use her god runes, and as for Aina, since when was this her usual style? She was trying to learn something completely separate from her usual, and she was clearly using this young woman as a whetstone. Alright, you 2 just keep fighting then. I'll be inside. Lionel casually waved a hand and walked through the battlefield. As for worrying about Aina, he didn't feel like he needed to. If the young woman didn't have an upper hand now, she would never get one. The young woman tried to stop Lionel but quickly found that she couldn't escape Aina even if she tried. It was only then that she, who had thought that she was still holding back and could still easily manage the situation, suddenly realized that this was very, very, very far from the truth. Like this, an odd scene played out. Aina and the young woman were locked in a clash, but every so often, another body would fly out from the store. If this person was lucky, they would be flung out of a door. If they were unlucky, they'd be flung out a window. The pile of green thread faction members continued to grow. Without a choice, the young woman could only roar, releasing her god runes and hoping to end her battle with Aina quickly, but who could have thought that Aina's body would suddenly bloom, delicate black tattoos stretching across her skin and forcing the young woman into yet another deadlock. No. It wasn't a deadlock. The injuries seemed to accumulate rapidly on the young woman's body. Her anxiousness played against her strengths. She didn't even realize that the moment Aina had drawn first blood, the battle was already over. But this was something she would learn very soon as Aina extracted what benefits she could from her and added her to the pile. Chapter 1497. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:45 a.m. Chapter 1497. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel patted his hands and opened the double glass doors to the treatment center from the inside, grinning at Aina. Right this moment, she had a slight sheen of sweat on her body, but it only seemed to make her more attractive. Aina hadn't worn makeup ever since the metamorphosis descended, but she only seemed to get more perfect as the days went on. Even in this state, she looked too good. If it wasn't for Lionel's status, who knew how much trouble her beauty would have brought them? Fighting Lionel was one thing, but stealing his woman was a completely different matter. Things related to marriage and future betrothals were all mostly decided by families. Considering who Lionel's parents were, even if he didn't become the heir apparent of the Morales family, there were very few who would dare to interfere in this. Even when it came to Elliot speaking of stripping Aina naked, this was more of a scare tactic than anything else. Doing something like humiliating Lionel's future wife was in line with castrating an individual. It was truly that important. For the same reason castration was taboo, crossing the line in this fashion wasn't something many would do. Only those who didn't care to give face to the Morales family would ever dare to do anything to Aina. Or, more accurately, dare to take things too far with Aina. It could be said that Lionel had most definitely benefited from his status again. Or else a woman like Aina, who was definitely soon to enter the Queen Beauty rankings, wasn't one most would idly sit by and watch a rookie like Lionel woo her without challenge. Lionel beamed a smile at Aina and stepped aside to let her in. "Welcome to your palace, my queen." It's a bit shabby, but make do with it for now. I'll find you a better one very soon. Aina laughed and shook her head, but the Green Thread faction members, still trying to pick themselves up outside, nearly vomited up more mouthfuls of blood, this time from rage rather than their injuries. Shabby? Not even counting the wealth of force herbs and other medicines they stored inside for the treatment of their patients, just the materials, architecture, and building itself cost almost 50 million void points. This wasn't an amount most galaxy-ranked disciples could even make without several decades of effort. But, even daring to spend it all in one sitting was another matter altogether. Too few would even dare to stomach such a thing. However, the couple didn't even seem to hear their grievances as they closed the doors, and entering the spacious lobby. So what do we do now? Aina asked. She had left all the planning to Lionel, and this man really couldn't be bothered to explain things ahead of time. By now, she had just learned to compromise and take certain things as they came. Well, first, there are still patients here. We'll need to treat them first. They'll be our vanguard as well as our advertisement. Aina rose an eyebrow before nodding in understanding. We'll have trouble beyond that, though, she responded. Even if word of mouth spreads that our service is good, not many would dare to come here, to begin with. I'm almost certain that their faction will take a page out of your book. Aina gave Lionel a look, but he only laughed at this. Of course, Lionel had thought of this as well. What was the strongest weapon of a large faction? It was obviously intimidation. One might be scared of Lionel, but he was still a single person, there were only so many places he could be at once. But, the Green Thread faction practically controlled all the medicine at the nominal, quadrant and galaxy ranked, having done away with all their competition. Even if others feared Lionel, he couldn't possibly deal with everyone who needed treatment from Triana's medical centers, right? Plus, Lionel didn't have the heart to do such a thing anyway. One reason he didn't destroy this building was that it was more useful intact, but the other reason was that he didn't want to harm the people who weren't related to this matter at all. There are a few ways I've thought to handle this. But the first and most important right now is anonymity. I chose a location nearby a Senate branch not because of safety, it wouldn't be safe here anyway after we offended them, and not for traffic either, after all by the time we're done, people will be flocking. I chose it because there'll be plausible deniability. Once I'm done, it'll be impossible to tell if someone came here to visit the Senate branch, or if they came to be treated. By the end, the flow-in will be so great that it'll no longer matter. So let's deal with these patients first, then we can go to the next step where you'll have to take center stage. There also happens to be someone here who should be somewhat useful to us. Aina raised a brow but didn't say much. The process was quick. The number of patients numbered in the high dozens, but the combination of Lionel's and Aina's abilities, not to mention the latter's expertise, and it felt like they were blessed by some sort of god. Under usual circumstances, patients would probably be reluctant to be treated by someone they didn't know, but disciples of the Void Palace didn't usually have such luxury. And, because the commotion didn't reach them, many had no idea that the two weren't even part of the Green Thread faction until they were discharged. What astonished those outside was that many who had entered half-dead began to come out mere minutes later in the best condition of their lives, only to be shocked to learn from the growing crowd that it wasn't the Green Thread faction that had treated them at all. Alright, they'll focus on building the formation to protect this place. Aina nodded. Then they'll go to the Force Pill faction. Knock their socks off, Lionel said with a laugh. Who says that anymore? You're getting old. Lionel could only watch Aina's hips sway off into the distance. In the end, he smiled and focused on his task. Very soon, his girlfriend would be sending the Void Palace into another shock, so how could he fall far behind? Chapter 1498. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:45 a.m. Chapter 1498. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. As Lionel worked, news began to quickly spread back to the Green Thread faction and beyond. It was quite rare for challenges like this to happen between factions, let alone for two individuals without a faction at all to suddenly rush up to challenge a faction on their own like this. It only made it a hotter topic when it was considered that the Green Thread faction had just been promoted to the silver grade. Lionel, though, had focused so much on the task at hand that nothing else seemed to matter to him at all. However, what no one could have expected that on this day, the situation would completely change. Boom. 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 Even if he didn't want to, at this point, Lionel had no choice but to snap awake, the sudden backlash of the incomplete force art nearly throwing him into the air. Lionel coughed violently, his expression warping. The ground shook and quaked, the earth that looked so sturdy and impenetrable before splitting in several regions. What the hell? Lionel grabbed out towards something to stabilize himself, his gaze turning cold as he ran through possibilities. His head turned up, looking in the direction that Aina had left, but he suddenly realized that it had already been half a day since then. He had been so focused that he didn't notice the time passing. This much wasn't unexpected. Lionel was already prepared for her to be gone for a while. According to their original plan, Aina would get certified by the Force Pill faction. Lionel had faith that Aina would perform astoundingly. Once she did, her name would spread for a reason other than her combat prowess, and then their next steps would flow much more smoothly. According to Lionel's estimations, it would probably take Aina about this long to succeed. But, before she could return, something seemed to have happened to the Violet Palace. Before Lionel could think any further, the coldness in his eyes vanished, and a portal the size of which he couldn't even fathom appeared. The Void Palace itself was already larger than any construct Lionel had ever seen. Its mountains and moons loomed in the vastness of space, stretching out for dozens of planets' widths and heights. Yet, this portal appeared to dwarf it in size. No matter where you were, whether at the bottom of the mountain or the top, and whether you were still in the fifth dimension or the well into the seventh, there was not a single soul present that didn't feel as though their souls were being sucked out of their bodies. Is that a zone? Lionel couldn't breathe. It didn't make any sense. The zones of the Void Palace should have long since been cleared. The only ones that remained open for missions were unique zones kept open so that their resources could be benefited from. It didn't make any sense for a new zone to suddenly appear like this one. And why was it so large? Lionel could barely tilt his head into the skies to find a flood of powerful auras rushing into the skies, each one of them wearing a serious expression. It was hard to tell if they understood what was going on, or if they were just as confused as everyone else was. But, at that moment, nothing seemed to matter at all. Unable to do anything to stop it, the Void Palace and all of its students, teachers, and volunteers were swallowed whole. In a distant location, Velasco's head snapped upward, his expression changing. If Lionel had been here to see his father, his own heart would have skipped several beats. This was something that he had never seen before. Soon, Velasco's shocked expression turned from surprise to unbridled fury, his glasses cracking and shattering beneath the pressure. Bits and shards threatened to blind him, and yet he didn't even blink a single time. A craft that had been formed of seventh-dimensional materials shattered and attacked the most vulnerable location on his body, and yet they rebounded off of his irises as though meeting a steel wall. From beginning to end, the usual prankster of a father didn't even flinch. Velasco's fury shattered the bounds of reality, the planet he was standing above going from whole to pierced through in the blink of an eye. It was as though a massive rod had run from its north pole to the south pole, its core being obliterated. Just like that, an eighth-dimensional planet was torn to shreds, its implosion cascading into the surroundings like a supernova's eruption. Velasco didn't say anything for a long while, simply staring into the distance. However, his expression became calmer and calmer until the point it seemed as though nothing had happened at all, until he erupted into boisterous laughter. The sonic waves that billowed out from his lungs formed concentric circles in the depths of space, the waves cracking and shattering space. It seemed no different from a normal laugh on the surface. In fact, it even sounded jovial. But anyone who knew Velasco was quite aware that he was absolutely enraged. Thoroughly enraged. The last people who had heard this laughter were those of the Void Palace almost 30 years ago, and now it had appeared once more. Why was he here in the first place? Why was he trudging and slaughtering his way through a different domain instead of staying by his wife's side and wasting the hours away teasing that useless son of his? It was precisely so that he could make sure that this exact thing didn't happen. And yet, they had actually dared to test his bottom line like this. It seemed that since he had disappeared for so many years so that he could raise his son, they had forgotten just who Velasco Morales was. He would make them pay dearly. And if a single hair was harmed on his wife's head, he would show them something worse than hell. As for his son, well, he could always make another one. Chapter 1499. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:45 a.m. Chapter 1499. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel snapped awake, his body shooting upward as his nerves were primed to an extreme. His mind ran on overdrive, scanning everything around him. But, he ultimately found nothing. He was in the depths of a forest, but it was oddly green. He hadn't seen such greenery in over years since he had been stuck in the Void Palace. But, this didn't put him at ease at all. Hadn't the whole Void Palace been swallowed? So how was it that he was no longer where he had been previously? How long had he been out of it? Did someone bring him here? No, that didn't make sense. Why would someone just plop him in the middle of a forest and then run away? He could sense anything in his near vicinity. Lionel took a breath and calmed himself. Then, he leaped into the tree by his side before plummeting back down once again. His eyes widened. This world? Just where was he? He had gotten used to the pinnacle's seventh-dimensional atmosphere of the Void Palace, and he had jumped accordingly. But, he actually hadn't jumped as high as he thought he should have? It couldn't be. Was this an eighth-dimensional world? That didn't make sense either. The combination of dense anarchic force and its pinnacle's seventh-dimensional atmosphere should have made the Void Palace no less difficult to navigate than any eighth-dimensional world. In fact, there were definitely eighth-dimensional worlds that couldn't compare to the Void Palace in this regard. However, the suppression Lionel felt on his body and his ability index was just as great if not greater. Lionel didn't even want to think about what this meant. Just what the hell kind of zone was this? That was when something in Lionel's mind suddenly clicked, a spark of lightning going off in his dreamscape. When the realization sunk in, he felt his heart tremble. He only had one thought: was this the end of the human race? Lionel took a breath and his expression went entirely cold. The pressure he suddenly felt was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. With all this talk of zones, unique zones, controlling them, and manipulating them, Lionel had a thought that he never put into action. What if you used zones as weapons of mass destruction? What if you suddenly trapped all the greatest geniuses of a race in a single zone? As for the entry limit? Who cared? In fact, wouldn't it be better to go over that count? Lionel had experienced it before personally. Back when he entered the Camelot zone, the members of the Slayer Legion and the Aderna family had died after being turned into walking dead puppets. However, after Lionel released them, the zone once again registered them as living beings. And, because Lionel had taken Little Blackstar out of the snow globe for the first time back then, the zone had registered one additional person. The penalty for one additional person hadn't been too harsh. But, their time limit had still been restricted. But, what if you went over 2 people? 10? 100? Several thousand? Millions? There were easily millions of youths in the Void Palace, and that was just the young. What about the older individuals? What if this zone also counted the cursed beasts in the mountains just like they had counted Little Blackstar back then? By then, the penalty would be so harsh that they might all be finished. Lionel wouldn't be surprised if they had already surpassed the time limit. But, he couldn't even check because he no longer had the dictionary by his side. It was a masterstroke, indeed. Whoever did this needed the ability to take control of a zone, change its location, and Lionel was certain that they would also have to be able to manipulate the size of the zone as well. After all, if the zone was too small, how would it swallow them all up like this? Lionel's expression only became colder the longer he thought. This wasn't just vicious, it was as good as committing genocide on an impossibly large scale. Everyone who had been sucked into this zone would never be able to return. Lionel took a breath and his heart finally slowed to a crawl. He couldn't help but internally sneer, his mind reaching an unprecedented level of focus. He definitely couldn't say that he was bored any longer. It seemed it was time for him to find out if this was the challenge he would be unable to overcome, or if even this wasn't enough. At that moment, the rustling of leaves entered Lionel's ears. He didn't seem surprised by this at all. The moment he had failed to jump into the tree, he had already felt that something like this would happen. The commotion he had caused was not small. Right then, a group of a half-dozen appeared. But, when Lionel saw their appearances, his eyes couldn't help but narrow. It wasn't that he recognized them, or that he was surprised that he didn't recognize them. Rather, it was that he was just not expecting such a thing. The group that surrounded him wore clothing right out of the Stone Ages. The women wore beast skins to cover their chests and bottoms, while the men just wore the latter. All of them wielded wooden spears and stared toward Lionel with a menacing light in their eyes. Without hesitation, they all pierced forward at once, but Lionel didn't even more. Just when it seemed that they would all skewer him through, the points of their spears shattered into a rain of ash, leaving them watching in shock as their weapons crumbled to the ground. Despite the fact that their weapons seemed simple, any weapon carved from a world of this caliber would be strong. They were used to hunting beasts tens of times Lionel's size without fear, but they suddenly felt their hearts constrict. They roared out, barking in a language Lionel couldn't even begin to understand. But, even as two of them seemed intent on continuing, another fell to their knees, followed by a second, and then a third. Chapter 1500. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:45 a.m. Chapter 1500. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's gaze sharpened, striking out with two palms, one right before him and the other to his left. While some have fallen to their knees, another contingent had chosen to attack directly instead. It was clear that these individuals weren't of one mind, and he still couldn't understand what language they were speaking. All he knew was that they seemed to be thoroughly enraged by his mere existence. A jolt of pain shot through Lionel's arms, causing his pupils to constrict. These people, he was sure that they weren't at his level. How were they so strong? Lionel's hips pivoted, his approach changing in the blink of an eye. From a direct approach, his movements became like flowing water, diverting the strength of the two that had attacked him off to his sides. His weight shifted, his elbow driving down toward the head of one as they lost their balance and stumbled forward. A sickening crack resounded, but the jolt that traveled up Lionel's arm caused his body to shiver, resulting in him almost missing the timing to attack the second individual. He instigated dream sense into action, splitting the sensation the millions of ways and dulling to the point his body's initial reaction whittled down to nearly nothing. Taking advantage of his recovery and his shift of momentum to a single leg, he lifted his other foot, ramming his shin into the nose of the second stumbling warrior. A spurt of blood followed another sickening crack. Just as quickly, they both crumbled to the ground, causing those that had chosen to kneel to cower even more. To them, Lionel's movements were beyond their understanding, but only Lionel himself knew just how much pressure he had been under just now. The strength of these people was no less than his own. It was just that his own technique was far more refined than their own, and his ability to adapt and react was far beyond even their imaginations. All things being equal, Lionel would have lost if the two of them ganged up on him. And, even if he could fight them one-on-one, he would very quickly find himself in an all-out brawl. It would have been difficult to tell just who would win or lose. Luckily, just then, Lionel had shifted from his more direct style and implemented concepts of gentle into his movements. If not, he had been very close to suffering just now. Even if his bones didn't fracture, his shoulders might have dislocated. It was hard for Lionel to accept this because he didn't feel the pressure of the sixth dimension from these people. But, from what he knew of the dimensional verse, unless you were an astounding genius of the other races, there was no way someone in the fifth dimension could have put him in such a state. Of those he had met, maybe only Amory, Aina and Miguel could match Lionel while still being in the fifth dimension. And that was just raw strength. Truthfully, Lionel didn't think he could possibly lose to some at the same strength. Part of the reason was likely because of the arrogance Aina had spoken about him having, but another part was justified. When Lionel had said he could beat Aina 10 out of 10 times and then gotten beaten up by her moments later, his thoughts had never really changed. If it came down to a matter of life and death where he could go all out, and he actually had intentions of winning, he felt that someone would have to be in the 7th dimension, at least, to make him truly despair. Lionel's greatest trump card, his mind, was something that most simply couldn't counter. Still, while he had easily defeated these few individuals, their strength astonished him. They were probably in the 5th dimension. But they actually had such strength? No, I can't tell what dimension they are at all. I have no idea, Lionel's brows furrowed. He had never had an issue with telling someone's dimension so long as they were close to his own or beneath him. Even for those far above, it wasn't too difficult to guess by process of elimination. But this, and this language. Aren't they human? Why can't I understand it? This was another thing that baffled Lionel. By now, he didn't even need to use language translation treasures anymore because picking up a new language for him had become far easier, especially since the highest echelons of the human domain all pretty much spoke the same language. Even when the language was a little different from what he was used to, his mind had become fast enough to pick up on the quirks quickly and adjust. He had done something similar on planet Luxnix. However, this language was so far and away different that he hadn't grasped it even after hearing the speak it for so long. Lionel's frown deepened. Without the segmented cube's inner space to rely on, he didn't have a convenient device to take out right now. I need to retreat. These people are already so powerful and nothing about them screams leadership, or else they wouldn't have been so divided in how to react to me. I'll need to find time to scout them and comprehend their language first, then we can consider a next step. With Lionel's thinking speed, the two he had defeated had hard fallen to the ground by the time he came to a decision. A strong light force swirled around him and his 3 illusory tails appeared once more. With a step, he leapt into the trees he could reach before, vanishing into their folds. He didn't miss the gasp and shock of these people when they saw his use of force. But, he could only note this and disappear. He wrapped himself in a thin layer of ethereal star force and hid in the trees, observing the group and planning on following them. Not long later, he was proven to be correct as a burly man who seemed very much like their leader appeared. Chapter 1501. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:45 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 1501. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The group quickly began to explain what had happened to their leader as Lionel watched. He passively absorbed what they were saying, filling in context clues and trying to piece together their language. For Lionel, this wasn't very difficult. It would take others a year or two of observing a language to reach a passable level, but Lionel would only take a few hours at worst so long as these people spoke enough. However, while he listened, his gaze couldn't help but focus on the burly man. The pressure he gave off was far beyond that of the others. Lionel felt that he was right to leave when he had. This man. Lionel really wasn't sure if he could defeat him. What was once again the most astonishing about this was the fact that Lionel couldn't tell the burly man's dimension either. But now, he began to understand why it was. The more he observed, the more possibilities he thought of until he eventually landed on one. Back when Lionel was in the 3rd dimension, he had broken through with his body and his mind first. In the former case, he entered the 4th dimension first, and in the later, it was even more exaggerated as he entered the 5th dimension long before stepping foot outside of the 3rd dimension. Now, he was in a similar situation, with his mind actually being in the 7th dimension currently. However, regardless of the situation, everyone had always seen him as a 3rd-dimensional existence back then, and right now, everyone only saw him as a 5th-dimensional existence. Why was that? Lionel had never really thought about it before, but now it seemed too obvious. Your dimensions seemed to be decided by the force level you could wield and control with your nodes. It probably wasn't so simple, but in all the 4th-dimensional books Lionel had read in the Void Library, this seemed to be the most appropriate conclusion. In that case, wasn't the reason Lionel couldn't tell the dimension of these people because they couldn't use force as he could? If they could, why would they be so shocked by his use of force just now? At that moment, the head of the burly man suddenly snapped in Lionel's direction. The sudden change was enough to make anyone's heart leap out of their chest. But, who was Lionel? He was a man whose mind worked at a speed that could put even a computer to shame. Let alone catching him off guard with the turn of a head, Lionel had already seen through the burly man's movements long before he made them and stood absolutely still, not moving an inch. Lionel wasn't a short distance away. With the sensory boost his starry-tailed fox gave him, he was able to listen in and observe this group from just over half a kilometer away. Even if he could see the burly man's face as bright as day, didn't mean the latter could do the same. Though it was surprising that the man was so sensitive, that was all. As expected, after furrowing his brows, the burly man turned back, continuing to listen to the reports. However, Lionel didn't relax. Such a powerful person definitely trusted in their instincts to a great degree. Even if he didn't find evidence of Lionel, he would proceed with caution as though there really was someone there. Plus, considering his people were likely currently informing him about Lionel's appearance right this moment, he had even more reason to be cautious. Minutes later, the burly man waved a hand and the explanation stopped. Well, by that point, it had fallen into a near all-out brawl between the two sides as those that had kneeled versus those that had fought clashed. By this point, Lionel understood some of their speech. Those that kneeled kept using a word that sounded like ladle to refer to him, while the people that had fought kept using a word that sounded like seiko. It was clear that one had a positive connotation while the other had a negative one. Lionel just couldn't quite understand if the latter group's animosity was rooted in something much deeper, or if they were just made he had so easily defeated them. Soon, the group began to make their way to their destination. It wasn't long before Lionel learned that the reason they had separated in the first place was that their leader was scouting out the situation ahead and laying out their plan of approach. What Lionel didn't expect, though, was to follow this group for 3 days as they found and hunted down a single beast the size of a small van. By that point, his throat was parched, and he had to use dream sense to stop his stomach from rumbling. Despite there not being any anarchic force in the air, this world made Lionel feel like he was once again a third-dimensional being. The only good news was that the group stopped to rest so that Lionel could sleep, and that by this point, he had already grasped their language entirely. It took longer than expected because they rarely spoke during their hunt, focusing on remaining quiet and stealthy. But Lionel's patience had finally paid off. "Well, return home now," the burly man said, looking off into the distance again. Lionel had made it a point not to antagonize the man during these days, keeping his eyes off of him. The man only seemed to have a sixth sense for Lionel's gaze, but not his presence. This meant that so long as Lionel didn't look at him directly for too long, he would slowly relax. It took another day before the group of 7 finally returned to their home, and by this point, Lionel felt like a walking skeleton. The good news was that he had managed to take advantage of some rivers they had passed by to deal with his thirst. He was able to take advantage of the water force concentration to deal with it. But food remained elusive. Every time they came across an animal, it would either run away or their hunting group would add it to their haul. Finally, Lionel could confirm their location before going off and dealing with his needs. The moment Lionel spotted the small village, he was ready to turn back and leave. But what he didn't expect was for an older gentleman to walk out to greet the group. Before Lionel could turn away and leave, yet another head snapped in his direction. It was the older man. Anne. Lionel was certain that unlike the failure of the burly man, he had been spotted this time. Chapter 1502. Published at 27th of December 2022, 8:45 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 1502. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel dove out of the way, a hair-raising feeling of danger drilling into his mind as the primitive man's instincts roared at him for the first time in a long while. Without hesitation, Lionel rolled out of the tree, his palm flipping over to reveal his self-made bow. Even as he fell from the tree, his gaze grew cold. He pulled the bowstring taut, his vision finding the one line of sight through the thickness of the trees. At that moment, the location he had just been sitting in suddenly imploded. It looked as though someone had planted a bomb into the core of the tree, only to trigger it right this instant. However, Lionel knew better. This was definitely related to the attention of the old man. Lionel took a breath, releasing his arrow and a breath all at once. Swift. The arrow shot through the air as though on rocket fuel. The sound of whistling wind didn't even reach Lionel's ears until it had already appeared before the old man's brows. No one even registered the beautiful curve the attack took through the trees. In fact, Lionel, who had begun falling from the tree, had still not even hit the ground yet. If one thought that the only weapon force that Lionel had strengthened during the last year was his spear force, you would be sorely mistaken. Even if the application wasn't the same, with Lionel's feel for the bow, his ability to translate his findings felt almost as natural as breathing. His talent in the bow seemed to be on a level all to its own. The old man was caught off guard. However, his vision alone seemed to carry some explosive strength all to itself. The moment he locked onto the arrow, even if it was in the final moment, it too imploded. However, the arrow had gotten so close to him that the explosion obstructed his vision, allowing Lionel to vanish from his sight. One would have thought that Lionel would take the opportunity to run, but almost as soon as he took the advantage, Lionel pressed. Dream Class. Sniper Archer. Lionel fired 3 more arrows before he even touched the ground, his bow force blazing with life and vitality. Each seemed to carry with it its own flair, reaching a level of freedom and unrestrained power that even Lionel's spear seemed to lack. But it was only right that things were like this. Lionel's bow force was being forcefully restrained to the 5th dimension from the 6th, while his spear force had yet to take that step. To an outside observer, though, this would still be a shock. One was supported by spear domain while the other was not. This should have closed the gap. And yet, Lionel's bow force seemed to have still left his spear force in the dust. The 3 arrows appeared within the ground in the blink of an eye, all 3 fluttering like soaring birds and curving toward the burly man. Lionel landed on the ground, his gaze sharp as he brandished another arrow. These 3 days he hadn't just been casually wasting time. Whenever he found a suitable branch, he would snap it off and form another arrow. In this time, he had already formed hundreds for a situation just like this one. The burly man, whose first instinct was to protect the old man even though the latter didn't need it, couldn't believe that he was actually the target. He reacted quickly, brandishing his spear toward the first coming arrow, feeling that the 2 trailing behind it were less of a threat. But, to his horror, the moment he pierced out with a strike he had practiced no less than 10,000 times, he actually missed. The arrow fluttered, slowing down a measure. In the grand scheme, it was akin to a car racing down the highway easing up from 100 kilometers an hour to 95, but in a battle this high level, such a sudden and abrupt change was enough to change everything. Thwack! The arrow pierced into the burly man's collarbone, throwing off his ability to be able to deal with the remaining 2 arrows. One pierced into his knee, ruining his mobility. The other tore into the soft side of his elbow, removing his ability to brandish his spear with both hands. Lionel, though, was still shocked by the outcome. Those arrows should have gone through the burly man's body entirely. And yet, it had sounded like he just stuck them into a solid tree. Just how strong was this person's body? Even Lionel, who had the Morales family's metal body technique, wasn't so sturdy, at least not without releasing both his divine armor and bronze runes, and even then he wouldn't be able to match up. Unfortunately, Lionel didn't get to linger on the thought for long, because he knew the vision of the old man would clear right this moment. He was already prepared, releasing the string of his arrow again. But, just as he was about to, his fingers paused. He could see it quite clearly. The old man was incredibly pale-faced, hints of blood falling down his cheeks like streaking tears. Lionel knew right then that even if the old man wanted to act again, he wouldn't be able to. Still, he kept his senses primed, walking forward slowly. He had taken advantage of the situation to deal with the burly man, so this was a chance he shouldn't give him. He wasn't sure if this small village had anyone else so powerful, but his deductions told him that the answer to that question was no. If there were, it was unlikely for someone with the status the old man seemed to have to come out to greet them personally. If Lionel was correct, then all of this village's strongest existences were right here. At that moment, the small group watched in horror as Lionel slowly walked out of the forest's edge, his bow still raised. If he was so effective from 500 meters away, none of them dared to imagine just what kind of monster he would be at this close a range. There was no way any of them could deal with such a thing. Chapter 1503. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:45 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 1503. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The old man breathed heavily, a concentrated look in his eyes. He seemed to be trying very hard to recover so that he could attack again. But, something about the coldness in Lionel's eyes seemed to tell him that he would be prepared for this. In fact, he seemed to feel that Lionel was untouchable. The burly man roared. Limping on one leg, he dove at Lionel, brandishing his spear with one arm. But, just as he was about to skewer Lionel through, his spear burst into a rain of ash. Losing his spear and without hitting the target he thought he would, the burly man fell forward, hitting the ground cheek first and skidding to a stop at Lionel's feet. When the old man saw this, his eyes opened as wide as saucers. Under the astonished gazes of the hunter squadron and the few who had come out of the village after hearing the commotion, the old man fell to his knees. Esteemed nobleman, please forgive my ignorance. He kowtowed as hard as he could, his forehead smashing into the ground repeatedly. Despite the fact that this location was mostly soft soil, the old man was so vehement that his forehead eventually split into a bloody wound. Lionel's eyes narrowed. Was this reaction because of his spear domain? Or was it something else? If Lionel didn't know better, he would think that he had somehow stumbled into the tribulation of his spear domain heirloom. He had found it very weird these past few days that he hadn't run into anyone from the Void Palace. Usually, when one entered a sub-dimensional zone, you were all taken to the very same place. When Lionel and Aina entered the Paris zone, they appeared in a village together. When Lionel entered the Camelot zone with the Slayer Legion, the only reason he had been able to go off on his own was that he entered first and then used his self-created craft to hide underground when the others appeared. Regardless of the situation, everyone who entered together always appeared together. It simply didn't make any sense that Lionel was on his own like this. So, he had assumed that something else went wrong. Maybe his spear domain heirloom was triggered again, moving his tribulation up even further. It felt possible since everyone he ran into seemed to use a spear as well. But, Lionel wasn't willing to conclude this. For one, the spear was an innately common weapon to begin with, especially in a more primitive setting like this one. People like to call the sword the first weapon, but the truth was that the first weapon, if not the rock, was most definitely the spear. Plus, there was also the matter of the sheer number of individuals that had entered. Lionel couldn't ignore the fact that the basic functions of this zone had been ruined by the oddity of their appearance within it. Stop, Lionel said coolly, speaking their language as though he had always been able to do this. It was only when Lionel said this that the old man paused. But, even then, the latter didn't raise his head, not daring to look up for fear of what might happen next. What is your name? Lionel asked. My name is Farley, nobleman. Lionel narrowed his eyes. He just wanted to test the bottom line of these people and also ensure that he had grasped their language as well as he thought he had. Where is this place, Farley? I've lost my way. Where is the fastest route back? Lionel wasn't specific with his words on purpose. Any ignorance on his part, if shown in too great a quantity, might result in this situation going south. Before then, Lionel had to make sure he secured as much information as possible. It made sense for a so-called nobleman like him to not know this place. It was a small village, nearby a stream of water, in the middle of a forest. It was doubtful that a person of high standing would know this place like the back of their hand. Sir, Slayle City is 2 days' journey southeast of here. Trith City is a day and a half's journey northwest of here. And Sing City is 3 days' journey west of here. Farley did his best to recall everything and gave all the information he knew of, not holding back. Since Lionel wasn't specific, he just told him everything, hoping one of these cities was Lionel's own. He couldn't help but hold his breath when he saw Lionel's lack of a response. Inwardly, Lionel was frowning. This wasn't because of the information, he had no reason not to trust it. Rather, it was that this little village seemed too weird. Southeast, northwest, and even west itself. This village was entirely surrounded by cities, so why did these people choose to stay here? It was a bit odd. It wasn't like traveling was the issue, these weren't particularly long journeys in the grand scheme of things. Also, danger shouldn't have been a problem either. After following the hunter squad around, it was easy for Lionel to make these sort of deductions. The population of beasts wasn't ridiculously high. In fact, their village didn't even have heavy defenses, there wasn't even a wall around them. So it was relatively safe, the distance wasn't too far, there were several cities to choose from, and yet they all chose to remain here? It wasn't that Lionel didn't believe that some would prefer to live in a more rural area, but when he thought about the split sort of reaction he received, one seething with hatred and the other worshipful as though he was a deity descended from the skies, his brows couldn't help but furrow. Lionel shook his head. "Give me some spices and I'll be on my way." Farley kowtowed again and did as Lionel asked, almost handing over way too much. After casually helping the burly man heal, Lionel turned toward the direction of Trith City, the closest of the three, and vanished. Chapter 1504. Published at 27th of December 2022 8:45 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 1504. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel grilled meat in one hand and seasoned it with the other. His Radiant Force and Scarlet Star Force might have been powerful fire forces, but they were no good at cooking. One was radioactive and the other was intent on destroying everything in its path. So, for something like this, Lionel could only use regular fire force. But, it was more difficult than he thought it would be. Lionel had never really struggled with pulling atmospheric force toward himself until he stepped foot into the Void Palace. By then, the anarchic force was so dense that using atmospheric force was mostly a pipe dream. This was a large part of why Lionel had still rarely used his Scarlet Star Force even after awakening the ability to pull it toward him on a whim. Lionel had thought that he wouldn't need to worry about it anymore while he was in this place since there was no anarchic force. But, just like with all the other oddities, he still struggled. Back when he was practically dying of thirst, he had to approach a river to find dense enough water force to satiate himself. Usually, he would be able to call upon water force whenever he wanted now, thanks to his divine armor. But if he did that here, he would be lucky to form a single drop. ND, a no VE1. This matter stretched to other things as well. For example, Lionel concluded that the reason his arrows hadn't been devastating was that he had shot from too far away. Previously, shooting from 500 meters away, so long as anarchic force wasn't present, was as easy as breathing. But, in this place, his bow force actually weakened so much over this distance. Now, his previous 500-meter range was about equivalent to his current 100 to 75-meter range. He would definitely have to adjust. Unfortunately, the problems just kept coming. After a day and a half, Lionel had still not spotted the city. His first thought was that the old man had lied to him, but Lionel frowned at such a possibility. He was very good at reading people. Even though he couldn't be considered to be a lie detector, he still didn't believe that Farley would have even dared to lie to him in the first place. Is it possible? A thought flashed in Lionel's eyes. He didn't consider for a moment that he had deviated from the right path, his sense of direction was too solid. He did consider the possibility that the old man's sense of direction wouldn't be as strong as his own. Plus, if the city was just a little bit off the cardinal direction the old man had stated, Lionel could end up way off. Still, Lionel thought that it was likely the hidden third open. And, over 3 more days after the initial day and a half estimate, he finally saw it looming ahead. As expected, the estimates for speed the old man had given were based on what he thought of Lionel, a realization that made the latter especially serious. Obviously, Lionel hadn't gone all out during the past several days and even took a lot of time to check around for clues and signs of human life, just in case he had veered off course. However, for Farley to underestimate his speed by 3 times, just how strong were these noblemen? And what would Lionel do now that he was here? Up ahead, an enormous city loomed. It was like a steel behemoth, its walls flashing with silvery lights and only the tallest buildings within being barely visible from Lionel's vantage point. However, very quickly, Lionel realized that the city was much further away than he thought it was. It was just that the city was so large that it had taken a moment for his perception to adjust. When he calculated how large it must be, his brows couldn't help but shoot up. Lionel entered stealth mode, becoming even more focused than he had been before. If Farley could see through him before, it was clear that his previous attempts hadn't been nearly good enough. Of course, Lionel had gotten complacent after 3 days as well, not to mention the fact that he had been hungry. But now, he was in top shape. Lionel didn't understand enough about this situation to enter the city so freely. He had to observe a bit first. As Lionel got closer, he realized he was still several dozen kilometers away. This wouldn't normally be an issue with his speed, but the main problem was that the number of beasts seemed to increase rather than lessen. At the same time, the force in the air seemed to also thicken. When Lionel finally managed to enter a kilometer range, his eyes couldn't help but widen. The entire city, no, it was only accurate to say that the portions of the city that Lionel could see were surrounded by an abyss. Chains connected the open city gates. Just from Lionel's point of view, there were 3. Each chain link was tens of meters across and their thickness didn't need to be mentioned. Those that wanted to enter the city crossed these paths, risking what seemed like life and limb just for a chance. And, from what it seemed, there were even some that were turned away at the entrance and forced to go back. Lionel watched as several fell to their deaths. Some had even been close but were assaulted by an unlucky rush of powerful wind. What kind of city is this? Lionel was at a loss. Was it worth risking life and death to enter? There were some that didn't seem to need to risk as much to enter. These individuals procured the help of large snake beasts that coiled their bodies around the chains to slither forward, swaying along with the chains. From what Lionel had seen, not a single ground escorted by one of these snakes had died. However, it seemed to be very expensive to gain such a service. In addition, it was mostly a route taken by individuals who seemed to be merchants. Lionel wouldn't be surprised if they gained a large discount for their efforts. Just as Lionel was thinking about whether or not the risk would be worth it, he froze. Right then, a merchant carriage rolled to the edge of the abyss. Unlike the other carriages, this one pulled along a cage on wheels. What made Lionel freeze was that within these cages, beaten and ragged, were Noah and Miguel. Lionel's gaze flickered with rage. Chapter 1505. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:34 and 31 seconds p.m. Chapter 1505. Who could? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. This scene confirmed to Lionel that he definitely wasn't in the spear domain zone. However, aside from that small bit of assurance, there was nothing else to be happy about. He couldn't say that he cared very much for Miguel, but he didn't hate him either. The two just had their own separate perspectives on certain matters. Lionel wouldn't just watch as Miguel was taken into what clearly seemed to be slavery without doing anything. And, even if Lionel had no intention of saving Miguel and he turned a blind eye to it all, he couldn't possibly leave his cousin alone like this, right? Lionel took a breath and calmed himself. P1E's visit N0VE1B, in. His gaze shifted toward the bridge and then the city. What little information he had told him that his best chance at saving these two was to act right this moment. With such a large city, with such a menacing atmosphere, Lionel was certain that whoever was in charge was a monster in their own right. Lionel hadn't even been confident in taking down the warrior of a little village without using some tricks. And, if not for his sharp senses and quick reaction time, he would have lost his life to the old man. Yet, it was all too obvious to him that they feared these so-called noblemen, down to the deepest depths of their bones. Even without seeing the strongest of this world, Lionel knew from this alone that they weren't to be trifled with. And, since these slave traffickers were acting in broad daylight, it was clearly within the rules of the city for them to act as such. This meant that Lionel wouldn't have morality on his side either. Plus, even if Lionel didn't have any of these reference points, just the fact that whoever had targeted the Void Palace dared to swallow up their seventh-dimensional powerhouses into this place as well meant that, in all likelihood, there were individuals here more than capable of dealing with such existences. There was always a possibility that this wasn't the case, but if the seventh-dimensional existences of the Void Palace could truly move freely, they would have long since made a huge commotion to gather up all the students to think of a plan. The fact they hadn't spoke volumes. Lionel's jaw clenched, his gaze flickering back and forth between several crucial points. I'm 100% confident in crossing the chain bridge, but fighting on it would be impossible. There's a 50-50 shot that I fall if I start a battle there, so it'll have to be before they begin crossing. But, if I attack before then? No, this is really the only choice. Lionel took a breath, his gaze turning frighteningly cold. His mind was only filled with one thought. If Noah and Miguel could be taken in like this, what about everyone else? How many had been taken into slavery like this? And what about Aina? Just die. Lionel was decisive. The moment he made his choice, he rose to his feet high in the trees and fired. Before anyone could realize what was happening, 3 heads were skewered through. Lionel had learned his lesson from the last time. 500 meters was much too far away, but this time, he was only 100 meters away. At this distance, his lethality was on a whole other level. Clang! Lionel's gaze flickered when his arrow failed to shatter the lock of the cage, but his hands didn't falter. He had already accounted for such a possibility. He didn't believe that his cousin or Miguel had been stagnant during the year it had been since he saw them. The fact they were captured spoke not only to the strength of their captors, but also their means. In the brief instant of Lionel's failed assault, the attention of several turned toward his location. If there was one weakness of being a sniper, it was that every shot would expose more information about your whereabouts. In this environment, Lionel couldn't curve his shots very much without using 6-dimensional force. So, after 4, many had already triangulated his position. A powerful aura came crashing down on Lionel from above, but the latter's sharp gaze didn't waver. He knew where these powerful auras were coming from. One was from the man he assumed was an overseer of the city. He was the one who had spoken with the carriage leader and brokered a deal between them and the city. The second was the carriage leader himself. The former wore what looked like a military uniform made of soft fabrics and covered in pockets and simple lines. But the latter was dressed like a wealthy businessman. If not for Lionel's sharp eyes, he would have never known that he was a powerful existence, to begin with. It was clear in an instant, the pressure these two gave off made the burly man of the village look like a joke. However, the fury in Lionel's eyes only grew. He could see it in their eyes. They were actually angry with him for trying to free slaves. He would have respected them more if they took this matter in stride, accepting that this was a normal part of the business they partook in. But, from their gazes, it was clear that they felt like they had an ingrained right to do as they pleased. Such people, quite frankly, disgusted Lionel. At that moment, the seal in Lionel's left kidney shattered, breaking through several layers all at once. From the size of half a fingernail, it grew to about half the size of a large grape, flooding Lionel's body with scarlet star force and turning his pale violet eyes into a liquid red gold. The 5th arrow was already prepared as Lionel's eyes flickered with dancing destruction runes, each more elaborate than the last. Since he had trouble pulling from the atmosphere in this place, he would just pull from his own innate node. Who could stop him? Lionel's fingers released his bowstring, a streak of crimson cutting through the air in its wake. Chapter 1506. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:34 and 30 seconds p.m. Chapter 1506. Shocking ability. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The eyes of the businessman and overseer widened, a spike of danger twisting into their hearts as they felt their lives flash before their eyes. They thought that they had already understood the strength of the attacker, but for this mysterious person's strength to suddenly skyrocket to this level, bang. The lock of the cage shattered. Flames raced across the bars like a disease or a curse, flashing with complex runes as they ruined the structural integrity of the metal. In one moment, the cage felt like it was impregnable. In the next, it crumbled to ash, whistling in the wind as though it was nothing more than the fluttering leaves of a dying tree. When the businessman and overseer realized that they weren't the target of the arrow, they inwardly breathed a sigh of relief, but their expressions became ugly not long later. However, in response, Lionel shot 3 more arrows, each twisting toward a vital point of their bodies. While none of these arrows were powerful by Scarlet Star force, the application of forceful to their bodies made them carry the strength of a shotgun. The wind clapped like thunder under the speeding arrows, the release of Lionel's bowstring sounding no different from an iron ball tearing a path out of a cannon. Miguel's expression flickered. How could he not be familiar with Scarlet Star force? With the rarity of the force, and the fact the person wielding it was trying to save them, he would be a fool to not think of Lionel. Truthfully, Miguel had a lot of reasons to hate Lionel. After all, because of Lionel, his years of effort and accumulated strength at the quasi-6th dimension was all ruined. Without Lionel's innate node, he had to find a completely different path to enter the 6th-dimensional God path, and as such, he was actually growing weaker by the day instead of stronger. However, Miguel never really took this personally, he just took it as him being unlucky. Whether he won the fight against Lionel or not, he would have still given Lionel his innate node back. The main reason he hadn't earlier was that it would have left him too injured to fight in the first place. Seeing Lionel now, though, left him with a whole host of complicated feelings. Still, these complicated feelings didn't slow his movements in the slightest. Miguel and Noah sprung action at once. Though their hands and feet were both bound, the two were experts in their own right. The chains that bound their ankles were 2 feet apart and were linked to the chains that bound their wrists. Still, they were able to begin running with a crouch and short steps. The two of them weren't the only ones in the carriage. In fact, there were others of the Void Palace inside as well. However, it was only the two of them who recognized Lionel without laying eyes on him and as such shot in his direction without hesitation. Seeing their reaction, many subconsciously followed while others broke off in different directions, hoping to take advantage of the situation. With most focused on a single path, there might be less people who chased after them. Lionel continued to cover their retreat, his arrows peppering the guards, businessmen and overseer to the point they couldn't even begin to run after the escapees. Each one of Lionel's arrows was menacing and placed in an awkward position. He aimed for their eyes, their knees, their feet, even their crotches. He held nothing back, assaulting them with numbers. Fuck. He can't use it anymore, charge forward. The overseer's skin suddenly flashed with a metallic light. His hands snapped outward as though he was throwing daggers, but he had nothing in his palms at all. To Lionel's shock, though, layers of the overseer's skin peeled off, attaching to the thick trees in the surroundings. Soon, the overseer shot forward, bouncing between the trees at a speed that was almost impossible to track. Between bounces, he would throw out more silver discs, attaching them to more and more trees. He flew forward like a speeding bullet, his body becoming a large streak of silver. It took no more than a single breath for him to cut the distance between himself and the nearest escapee to less than 5 meters. Lionel was stunned by what he was seeing. He could tag this ability to a specific ability index, and it even seemed like a combination of many of them, including Alan's magnet ability index. However, that was all. The overseer might be far faster than Lionel now, but his movement had also become far more predictable. Facing an enemy like Lionel, he had basically just sealed his fate. Lionel didn't even take a breath of time to calculate, his fingers having already released. The overseer suddenly panicked. He released that with the way Lionel's arrow had curved, he was adding to its force with his own momentum. Even if Lionel didn't use Scarlet Star Force again. Thwack. The overseer was pierced through the forehead, the head of Lionel's arrow tearing into his skull just as the body of the arrow exploded into countless pieces. With a heavy thump, the overseer crashed into the tree he was magnetically attached to. There was such speed and force behind it that the tree cracked, beginning to slowly fall forward. Lionel frowned slightly. This was a bit of a problem. He took a breath, six-dimensional force spinning around his arrow as he released it. It tore through skies so quickly that there was absolute silence even after it crashed into its target. P1E's visit N0VE1B, in. T-bang. The arrow curled around, smashing into the side of the tree. An explosion sounded, a huge chunk of the bark and trunk imploded until it looked as though a giant had taken a giant bite out of it. The falling tree deviated, stopping its forward momentum and beginning to fall back and to the side. The pursuing guards, businessmen and lagging overseers suddenly found the behemoth-like shadow of a tree quickly falling toward them, their faces contorting in shock. Chapter 1507. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:34 and 29 seconds p.m. Chapter 1507. Not enough information. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Heavy breathing filled the depths of the forest as a group of escapees gathered around one another and leaned on the thickness of the trees around them. At that moment, Lionel appeared at the treetops, his face still obscured by a blinding golden light. Seeing such a thing, Miguel and Noah frowned for a moment, but after realizing the potential issues, their brows relaxed. As the saying went, when smart people met together, there wasn't a need for so many words. The three of them very quickly came to a tacit understanding. "Where are you all from?" Lionel spoke in the language of the village people. Very quickly, he could see who among them grew confused and who among them responded with acknowledgement. It was just that easy for Lionel to tell who came from the Void Palace and who didn't. Aside from Miguel and Noah, there seemed to be three others. Still, this wasn't 100% factual. For all Lionel knew, there were different dialects. But, from what he had observed around the city, at least in this region, everyone should speak the same language. Lionel received many answers to his questions, much of which he couldn't really understand. They spoke of landmarks and locations he had never heard of, but they did so with confidence, so it was obvious that these were likely common places everyone knew about. After hearing their words, Lionel went through everyone one by one and began to destroy their shackles. It was more delicate work than breaking the cage had been, harder too, but since Lionel could use his hands, it wasn't that big of a problem. Their gazes toward me turn a lot more worshipful the more I use my abilities. It seems like I was right about some stuff. Lionel could have shot more than one arrow of Scarlet Star Force, however, he had purposely chosen not to, his mind thinking of the old man that had tired out after using his ability just twice. Although there wasn't much information, nor enough data points, if Lionel was correct, as he usually was, this world likely separated itself into people with powerful abilities and those without. And it was likely that the marker for powerful abilities was whether it could manifest itself in some sort of outward projection of force or not. In addition, though this was a greater stretch and a conclusion that Lionel was more doubtful of, there seemed to be more restrictions on abilities in this place as well. These restrictions likely weren't a product of their birth, but rather the world itself. This place was more stifling than even a Pinnacle's seventh-dimensional world flooded with anarchic force. In such an environment, the suppression of ability indexes was also exceptional. N0. E. LBI. N. ET. If it wasn't for Lionel's ability strengthening in the Rapax nest, even his own ability index would have fallen to tier 3 or even worse in this place, let alone the average person. As such, in a place like this one, those that could display powerful abilities were even rarer than they were back in Lionel's dimensional verse. And, as a result of this, there was an even clearer dividing line between the talented and untalented, even to the point there was slavery here. Still, this left more questions than answers. Where was this place? What point in history did it represent? The human domain didn't have such a powerful world anywhere. Could it be a snippet of the future? Was this a variant zone? It was possible. A variant zone appeared when a world was at a crossroads and it was a chance to turn things around for the better. But, a variant zone was also known for its low difficulty. What about this place was easy, exactly? And where were the rewards? Plus, a variant zone wouldn't be styled after a real world, at least not usually. It would be more like a challenge or a game, left behind by future generations who didn't like how things had turned out. This was why the only variant zone Lionel had ever heard of was found on terrain and entered by Aina. That wasn't to say that a variant zone couldn't be like this, but it wasn't the most efficient use of resources for a world likely on its last legs, to begin with. Then the only logical conclusion seemed to be that this was a zone not from the human domain, but another domain entirely. But in that case, why was it that everyone here was human? Even the powerhouses who ran the city seemed to also be human. From what Lionel had learned from Wise Star Order, it wasn't that humans didn't exist in other domains, it was rather that they were instead treated like second-class citizens. However, clearly, there were humans in power in this place. Unless there was another tier of overseers that Lionel hadn't seen and humans were actually selling their own to their other race overlords, this conclusion seemed unlikely as well. Then what was the truth? Quite frankly, Lionel had no idea. After freeing them all, Lionel was profusely thanked and he didn't stop any of them from leaving. However, he did take the opportunity to secretly tag some of them, tracking their location for a while both so that he could place a mental mark on the locations they spoke about and, for a more unfortunate reason. Once they were all gone, Lionel was left with just the Void Palace members, but he still wasn't quite sure if he should reveal his face just yet. If this was truly a hopeless situation, that would mean that this would essentially be their world now until they died. In that case, he couldn't trust anyone even if they were formerly from the Void Palace. Once despair sunk in, who knew what people would do? You five don't seem to be able to understand me? Lionel trusted in the genius of the Void Palace disciples. After so many days, he didn't believe that they wouldn't have picked up at least some of the language even if they lacked his processing speed. After several attempts, though, Noah eventually said something that left Lionel in silence. Body. Weak. No. Force. Lionel's eyes narrowed. What was going on? Chapter 1508. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:34 and 27 seconds p.m. Chapter 1508. Touching? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Was Noah trying to say that he couldn't use force? Honestly, while the group was running, Lionel had noted that they hadn't used force. Although Miguel had lost the speed branch after stepping past the snowy star owl lineage factor, Noah definitely still had it. It didn't make sense that he wouldn't try to multiply his speed as he ran. Lionel had thought that it was related to the chains wrapped around their bodies. After all, Earth had force-blocking methods, so even though Lionel hadn't run into such a thing at higher dimensions, that didn't mean that they didn't exist. Maybe he had just been lucky to not stumble into such a thing. However, while Lionel had been destroying their bindings, other than the strength and power of the ores used to forge them, he didn't sense anything else about the chains. If they had been designed to block force, they would have resisted his Scarlet Star force a lot more and a lot better as well. Lionel's brows furrowed behind the mask of bright light that covered his face. He turned his attention toward the others and their reactions seemed to be similar. Even Miguel, who should have been close to if not the most talented among them, reacted in the same way. But, he should have known. Miguel and Noah should be equally as talented, actually. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if Noah surpassed Miguel in the future with the setbacks the latter has faced. But for them both to be in this situation, Lionel felt like a headache was coming along. He thought he had finally gained some help and support, but instead, the people here were actually so weak. This was more than a little troublesome. He couldn't understand what was happening no matter how he racked his brain. This world was, indeed, stronger than the Void Palace grounds, but it wasn't exaggerated to the point that such geniuses couldn't even bring out at least a portion of their strength. Lionel needed more information. He had to enter the city. Lionel stood before he hesitated slightly. Leaving everyone here without his protection would make things a bit troublesome. They had been caught once already, what if they were caught again? Clearly, they didn't have the strength to protect themselves. No, that wasn't exactly true. Although they couldn't use force, their bodies were still quite powerful, and that was especially so for Miguel, who had the white stone elephant lineage factor. Lionel shook his head. He obviously couldn't bring them into the city with him. They wouldn't even be able to cross the bridge in their current state. Gritting his teeth, Lionel made a decision. You all will have to protect yourselves. Stick together, there is power in numbers. Head in, Lionel explained how to get to the village. Although he wasn't completely certain, he believed that the villagers would take them in. He hadn't spent much time there, but what he did know was that the village was in need of helping hands. If they had more hunters, their lives would be easier. Plus, Lionel would also have a method of finding them faster. After he was finished, he gave a small signal to Miguel and Noah, both of whom understood. They were grown men, after all. Even if Lionel wanted to coddle them, they wouldn't allow it to happen. Their pride ran deep. They had been caught once, but they wouldn't allow it to happen again. Plus, they realized the gravity of the situation. Lionel was like a light at the end of the tunnel, but if there were really so few of them who could use their force, what chance did they stand of getting out alive? This might be a world, but it wasn't their world. And, even if they forced themselves to feel comfortable here, what of the human race? What would they do without them? Weren't they meant to be the protectors of the human domain? The frontline warriors? How could they not do everything in their power to return? And, even if they could forget their duty and stay here indefinitely, they were geniuses. They were used to wielding power and authority. How could they settle for being the bottom rung of society? Lionel turned and left, the group watching as his back disappeared with clenched fists. Noah rose to his feet, his emperor's might flickering in his eyes with a dense green. In the past, it had been able to blanket his surroundings in an oppressive pressure. But now, it was like a caged dragon, continuously ramming against its cage to no avail. Let's go, everyone. Lionel appeared by the edge of the abyss once again. The commotion had yet to die down, and there were several more overseers in the region. Some had surrounded their dead companion's body, others were still discussing how to capture Lionel and his friends, while there was another group that Lionel was sure had likely already set off on a hunt. Still, despite this, Lionel acted as though nothing special was going on, strolling forward until he was eventually stopped. Halt! Lionel, who had spent hours observing the city, was already long since prepared. His hand flashed with bronze runes and he smacked the hand of the overseer away. His actions were so abrupt and powerful that a resounding clap sounded through the atmosphere, followed by the crack of bone. Who the hell do you think you're touching? The overseer who had tried to stop Lionel had been reaching a hand for Lionel's chest and definitely hadn't expected such a thing to happen at all. However, he only paused for a moment before he grabbed his hand in agony, falling to the ground as he sucked in a cold breath. With the influx of overseers in the region, not all of them were as powerful as the one Lionel had killed. Realizing this, Lionel had purposely aimed for one he was certain he could handle, teaching him a swift and savage lesson. Without another word, he walked toward the chains and hopped on. Chapter 1509. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:34 and 25 seconds p.m. Chapter 1509. Shameless. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The overseers looked over to see their companion on the floor, but none of them moved to do anything. In fact, some of them shook their head and sneered. Rookies. As an overseer, you had a great deal of authority, but you required the strength to enact it first. If you targeted the wrong person, well, this would be your outcome. Lionel had observed enough to see the subtle sort of balance that was played out here. This world was far more unregulated than the ones he was used to. Just judging by the fact that people died here every day trying to cross the chain bridges spoke volumes. This place was one where power spoke above all else. In that way, it wasn't too unlike the Void Palace. But, Lionel highly doubted there were rules against killing here. One might wonder, then, why it was that Lionel was chased like he was. That was even simpler. Where power ruled and money talked, there were obviously some people's bottom lines that shouldn't be touched. The fact slavery was allowed here meant that there was someone higher up that benefited from them. The overseers watched in silence as Lionel crossed the bridge. Since this young man they had never seen before dared to be so arrogant, he should have the strength to cross the bridge as well. Honestly, even they as overseers would choose to ride the snakes across unless it was an urgent matter. It wasn't that they didn't have the strength to cross, it was rather that no one would want to place their lives at risk for no reason. The rookie overseer who was still seething on the ground couldn't help but look toward Lionel's back with red eyes, hoping that he would fall over to his death. But he didn't dare to voice this out loud. The chain swayed beneath Lionel's feet and his eyes narrowed. His control over his body was immaculate, but even he felt shaky in this place. There was definitely something deeper to these chains, something that went beyond what the naked eye could see. Lionel tapped his foot and shot forward as though he was racing across a track. His actions left the overseers frozen. There were very few who dared to use that kind of speed on the chains, they were few and far between. However, something told Lionel that this kind of speed was the only way to ensure his survival. The odd rushes of wind, the rhythmic swaying of the chains, there was something oddly hypnotic about them. Lionel subconsciously wanted to find out more, but it was precisely because of this that he blazed for. He had a feeling that if he focused so much on it, he truly would fall. In just a few minutes, Lionel had made it to the other side. But the fact it took him so long at such a speed was enough to show just the kind of behemoth-like city he was dealing with. When Lionel entered the gates, he found a world of metal. The homes, the shops, the skyline, all of it was encased in some sort of silvery metal, some sections far more rusted than others. The combination made some of the city look like a futuristic utopia and other parts look like the dilapidated ghettos of a dystopian hellscape. The push and pull somehow reminded him of the swinging chains to his back. Why did it feel like everything about this place was playing on his mind somehow? Lionel walked forward, trying to get a lay of the city. He had come here for information, but he didn't even know where he should be going, or even what he was looking for information about, truthfully. The answers he needed felt too broad. Understanding would require a comprehensive understanding of a world he had only just stepped foot into. Maybe there's an easier way? A library? An information center? What should I do about currency? It would feel suspicious if I just entered the city only to leave because I didn't have a place to sleep. After observing the city for a while, there seemed to be a lot of people who enter, but those that left were far fewer and didn't seem to be the same individuals either. Lionel shook his head. I should have extorted that overseer for some cash. It didn't take long for Lionel to learn about the currency system. He just needed to casually observe some shops for a bit. The currency system this city used was coin-based. Oddly enough, though, these coins seemed to flicker with their own light as though there was a universe of stars hidden within them. Lionel was entirely certain he would have to personally inspect them to see what was so special. Luckily, there were many who entered the city like Lionel who were looking for jobs and money. It didn't take long before Lionel found a job center, with a long lineup outside. Unfortunately, while Lionel could speak the language, he couldn't read it, so it had taken him longer to find this place than he cared to admit. But, after reading so many signs and posters, and cross-referencing with the services they gave, he was slowly building a database of their alphabet as well. What job would you like? An uninterested voice came from the counter. The middle-aged woman behind it had already sunk into the monotony of her life and job, so she wasn't very eager to show any enthusiasm. Lionel was a bit embarrassed because he could read the postings very well. So, instead of taking such a route, he decided to be a bit shameless. Good afternoon, gorgeous. How about you help me out a bit? I need a job that is easy and high-paying, do you have one? Lionel leaned forward, whispering so that only the woman behind the rusted metal counter could hear him. The woman was quite used to such asks, so she looked up, still uninterested. Until, that is, she met Lionel's eyes. Something about their pale violet drew her in. What beautiful eyes. Chapter 1510. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:34 and 24 seconds p.m. Chapter 1510. Bunny, if audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. Lionel smiled as he strolled away from the counter, his mission successful. However, he soon cleared his throat and put on a semi-serious expression. He would have to take this to his grave. He definitely couldn't let Aina know he was selling himself like that. He couldn't appear to be so cheap, his body was sacred. Lionel looked down at the permit in his hands, oriented himself, and began to walk forward. Truthfully, he was a bit worried about what he had gotten himself into. A job that was both easy and high-paying didn't come so freely, as ironic as it might sound. And, remembering that knowing, coy smile the middle-aged woman had given him, Lionel could only shake his head. But, this was the best option he had. He could take a laborer's job, but if his head was stuck in a mine or an oil rig all day, how would he find the information he needed? No matter what world you were in, information was the resource of the strong and powerful. In that case, Lionel could only aim for the very top. When Lionel reached his destination and saw that it was actually a high-class restaurant, he grinned. It seemed he had hit the jackpot. Not wanting to cause trouble, Lionel wrapped around back. Nothing would be worse than ruining such a good thing. It only took a glance to see the kind of people they let into this place. If Lionel tried to enter with his current clothing, he would get chased out with a broom. After reaching the back stealthily, Lionel knocked on the door a few times and waited. About a half-minute later, the head of a man wearing what looked like a chef's cap poked out, a large cloud of steam following him. The man's face was so rosy that one would have thought that he was doing something very different from cooking. "Who are you?" The man's voice came out in a loud shout. It was either he was too used to his bustling work environment, or there was something wrong with his ears. Still, Lionel didn't say much and just handed over the permit. "Ah, a new brat? Good, good. And you're actually sensible enough to come around back instead of scaring away all my customers, not bad. If you can survive a few hours, I might call you back tomorrow." Lionel's lip twitched. What was that supposed to mean? Wasn't this supposed to be an easy job? Come to think of it, there's actually a group of ladies that just came in. Good timing. Lionel found himself being pulled in by his collar like some sort of ragdoll. This man had more strength than it seemed. Why he would become a cook with this level of strength was beyond Lionel entirely. "Kara, get the new brat into an outfit and show him the ropes." When Kara rounded a corner, Lionel choked on his own spit. He didn't like where this was going one bit, not the slightest bit. This wasn't an easy job at all. In fact, if he wasn't careful, he would leave here only after losing a layer of skin. Kara was dressed like a bunny rabbit, her legs covered in fishnet stockings. Lionel was in an all-new world, but he was sure that this was a universal language all men could understand. She was tall, or maybe it was just the 6-inch high heels she wore. Either way, her legs were definitely long, slender, and toned. The black leotard she wore gripped tightly to her ground and around her waist, wrapping around her back to split what must have been 2 fleshly mounds into 4. It wasn't shy about tightening around her in the slightest, and that pattern continued with her chest as well. Kara was definitely a world-class beauty, but her outfit only made it all the more exaggerated. And, like a finishing touch, her fake bunny ears actually moved along with her eyebrows as though they were real. Kara must have thought that Lionel was ogling her by this point, but the truth was that Lionel never really reacted to women outside of Aina, even if they were objectively just as beautiful. Though, in this case, Kara was actually a tick below. What Lionel was really reacting to was the realization of what he had gotten himself into. He wanted to shed tears, but it was already too late. That middle-aged woman had really taken nice care of him. "All right, come. My customers are waiting, I only have a few minutes." Kara pulled Lionel along toward the back of the kitchen and dragged him into the workers' change room and office. Without a care for Lionel's gaze, she turned her back to him and pulled down her leotard to her belly button, revealing a beautiful back view. Then, she reached into her locker. With one hand, she pulled off a pair of nipple pasties, and with the other, she replaced them with a new, less sweaty pair, before pulling her leotard back up. She took no more than a few seconds to finish. Once she was done, she went to the only desk in the room and pulled open a drawer, taking out a new uniform. This is the uniform for the male workers. Most of them can't hack it, and those that can are usually chased away by the customers. Those women have pretty high standards, but judging by your looks, you should pass with flying colors. The only question is how entertaining you can be. Female customers are more difficult to please than male customers are, so you'll need to work harder. Think of a routine, or find something interesting to chat about. Remember the rules, though. They're a bit different for male hosts. Touching can only be initiated by the customer. All forms of sex are not allowed within the walls of the restaurant. And, above all else, the customer's pleasure comes first. Lionel caught the uniform Kara threw over and watched her sway out. He stood in silence for a long time, not knowing what to think. Fuck. Chapter 1511. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:34 and 23 seconds p.m. Chapter 1511. Bonus. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Bonus chapter for 5,250 golden tickets, next at 67.50. Fallen Apostle Volume 2 pre-order is live. Information in author's note below, smiley face. Lionel sighed. All things considered, this sort of place really was the best to use to gather information. A gathering of noble and rich people, all a little too drunk to always act in their best judgment, this was the perfect place. Forgive me, Aina, this is for the greater good, I swear. Lionel stripped and began to put on his uniform. When he saw what it was, he sighed a breath of relief. At least it wasn't too outrageous. He had been expecting the worst, skin-tight Speedos, oil, and maybe a pair of bunny ears for himself, the works. Luckily, it wasn't that exaggerated. The pants were a pair of dress pants. Though they were a bit tight, it wasn't too bad. Lionel was just surprised that they actually had a set tall enough for him. The shoes matched the pants quite well. Lionel slipped them on and then clipped on the suspenders to the pants. As for the shirt, I knew it was too good to be true. Lionel looked up toward the ceiling. There was no shirt. Lionel weakly put on the bow tie, his eyes threatening to flood with tears. Then, without a choice, he stepped outside. The steam of the kitchen assaulted him once again, only making matters worse. With this moisture clinging to him now, he might as well have lathered himself in oil too. Oh, who would have thought? You actually had quite the frame under there, huh? The chef, who Lionel had realized by now people called Chef Luca, laughed when he saw Lionel's appearance, nodding to himself. While he spoke, several of the female cooks couldn't help but look over as well, twice, even. Lionel's metal body definitely did him several servers. Whether it was vascularity or muscle definition, he didn't lack any of it. Plus, he also wasn't overly large and could even be considered to be quite slender. He truly did have a lethal attraction to a certain demographic, and it only made it better than his face was quite handsome as well. Just when Lionel was going to respond, another bunny lady poked her head in. Chef Luca, VIP 3 is still clamoring. You said the newbie would be ready soon. Chef Luca slapped Lionel on the back, nearly sending him sprawling forward. Yup, the kid's right here. Don't eat him up before he gets up there, he's for the customers. The new bunny girl's eyes lit up when she saw Lionel, eyeing him up and down. Her hand even had the audacity to reach for his crotch as though she wanted to check the goods, but was quickly caught by Lionel's hand. She giggled as though it wasn't a big deal. Feisty. If you let me touch I would have given you a taste, too bad. All right, come, they're waiting. Lionel could only speechlessly follow. He had been about to get angry at the bunny girl, but she moved on so quickly that he couldn't even ramp up a response. It was either she really didn't take it to heart, or she was also too good with certain kinds of social interactions. When Lionel stepped out of the kitchen, he was hit with a wall of sensory information. The first floor was quite bustling. Waiters dressed in skimpy clothing glided in and out of the kitchen, customers shouting out their orders or demands, and in the background, and odd music that seemed a cross between rock, jazz, and hip-hop played. There weren't very many women on the first floor at all. In fact, the only women were the waiters and all the customers seemed to be men. However, as Lionel traveled up the stairs, he could see more female customers, usually hidden behind doors. It seemed that even in this world, women were more secretive about this kind of stuff. Though, Lionel was a bit baffled that this was a co-ed sort of place. Usually, such gentlemen and women's clubs were for one gender or the other. Hey race VIP room 3. Go get 'em tiger. Lionel was unceremoniously kicked into the room. He even felt that it was a bit of payback for snubbing her earlier, something that was confirmed when he heard her voice from the other side. If you survive this, handsome, I just might forgive you. My name is Amory, by the way. Amory's giggles faded as Lionel turned his attention to the room before him, the sliding door closing to his back. Lionel had expected a similar sort of reaction to what he had received outside. He assumed that women who came here were quite eager and forward. Plus, Amory had even described them as clamoring. But, when he actually saw the state of the room and its guests, he didn't even know what to say. There were 4 pairs of cold eyes staring back at him, each colder and more frigid than the last. Of course, each of them was also paired with the face of a beauty. Or, maybe that was more surprising than expected. There were 5 total people, the 5th of them seeming to be the most amused of them all. Lionel didn't need anyone to tell him that this mischievous young woman had probably been the one to insist on his appearance. From what it seemed, the others didn't even welcome him here, and that just made the clothing he was wearing seem even more inappropriate. Lionel wasn't a person who got embarrassed easily, but that was more a product of the way he lived life. He did and acted as he pleased, following his own mind and heart, so of course there was nothing to be embarrassed about. But this, he hadn't planned or decided on any of this. To make matters worse, of the 5 women, only 2 were the young age of the mischievous woman. Of the other 3, 1 looked to be over 50 years old, while the other 2 seemed to be in their late 30s to 40s. Of course, this wasn't their real age and they were likely much older. But, as a person of Earth, Lionel had gotten used to judging people like this. At that moment, a flicker of killing intent flashed within the eyes of one of the 2 middle-aged women and Lionel's heart skipped a beat. It seemed he had really gotten stuck in something ridiculous this time. Chapter 1512. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:34 and 21 seconds p.m. Chapter 1512. Off guard if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. It didn't take a genius to understand what the problem was. Reputation was a woman's currency in worlds like this. Or, more accurately, this sort of reputation in specific. The young woman might have thought that this was a funny joke to play on her elders, but clearly she hadn't thought of the fact that doing such a thing put Lionel in danger. These women were all of high status and the pressure they gave Lionel was not small. They made the burly man and even Chef Luca look like jokes. Lionel had no doubt that if they wanted to kill him, or at least someone in the 5th dimension like himself, it would be a simple matter. These women had likely not even known what kind of establishment this was before they came, only deciding to dine here at the poking and prodding of the woman. And now Lionel was stuck in the middle of this mess. In their eyes, the easiest thing to do would just be to kill Lionel and be done with it. As for the young woman, at worst she would get a light reprimand. The fact that she had dared to do this in the first place reeked of coddling. This young woman had definitely been doted on and spoiled all her life. But, at the end of the day, Lionel wasn't a normal person. The hint of killing intent he had sensed was all it took to flush the embarrassment out of his system, his own gaze even flashing with its own coldness for a moment as he stood straight. However, as quickly as the coldness had appeared, catching the oldest woman of them off guard, it vanished. This older woman was the only one to have shown killing intent, but that didn't mean the others wouldn't have caught on quickly. It was just that this woman was the most experienced of them and understood the magnitude of the situation very quickly, so much so that she was ready to act almost instantly. Clearly, given her strength, Lionel's own thinking speed might actually be inferior to hers. That said, that didn't mean that Lionel's reaction would be slow. Just when the coldness in his eyes vanished, he revealed a bright smile. Taking a step toward the table, he did something that left the women speechless. Lionel picked up a large pitcher of water, raised it high, and poured it. This much would have been fine if his aim was a cup, but to the horror of the women, he poured the water toward the head of the mischievous young woman who had caused all of this to begin with. The young woman squealed, expecting a splash of water to drench her through. The other women were so caught off guard by the happenings that they, too, didn't know how to react. Was this young man crazy? Did they scare him so much that he lost his wits? Despite having the strength to dodge the water quite easily, as Lionel had deduced, this young woman had been coddled all her life. If even her seniors couldn't react to such a ridiculous situation, how could she? She ducked and covered her head with her hands, her speed actually fast enough for Lionel to raise an internal eyebrow. Other than this, though, Lionel was quite calm. In fact, he was sighing a breath of relief. So long as they didn't act now, they wouldn't act later, at least not until much later, that is. Luckily, they hadn't thought of the possibility that he could be trying to start a wet t-shirt contest. If they did, then he really would be finished. But, to these prim and proper older women, when would they have ever stumbled into such a thing? They would probably only realize the problem after the young woman was drenched. That said, Lionel never had any intention of actually doing that. Just when the water was about to hit the young woman's hand-covered head, Lionel's free hand rose and sparkled with a delicate bluish-black energy. Like that, the flowing water became a sled of ice, the ice cubes that had once been in the pitcher following the winding trail of Lionel's fingers. The ice cubes became like sleds flowing down a mountain of snow, curving and often nearly falling time and time again as though they were in a real race. The ice track wound around Lionel and the young woman's bodies, filling the room with a refreshing cool air that it had lacked before. Then at the end of it all, the ice cubes fell from the end of the track and it seemed as though Lionel had finally made a mistake. But, to the astonished gazes of the women, one by one, the ice cubes neatly stacked themselves into a tall tower, wavering only slightly, but ultimately remaining steady. Wah! The young woman had long since risen her head, watching this scene with a hint of unconcealed delight in her eyes. She had never seen anyone with such masterful control of force before. At that moment, Lionel clapped his hands and the slide of ice shattered into twinkling crystals that he quickly caused to gather up above his hand. With a pitcher in one hand and a twinkling ball of ice in the other, Lionel brought them together once more. Just like that, there was a plop of water and the ice had once again become a pitcher of liquids, the frosty force having been pulled out entirely. Lionel flicked his wrist, allowing the frosty energy to shoot toward the ceiling as he used his now free hand to pick up another pitcher of water. Then, he began to pour them both over the tower of ice cubes without even the slightest hesitation. Right then, the ball of frosty energy he had thrown into the air fell back down, colliding with the two streams of water and the ice cube until they all formed a giant cube of ice about the size of a head. Lionel placed the two pitchers of water down and revealed a charming smile. He tapped his foot on the ground, causing the table to quake and allowing a butter knife to fly up, spinning into his hand. Then the butter knife began to glow with a golden light that caught the older women off guard and left the young woman dazzled. Chapter 1513. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:34 and 22 p.m. Chapter 1513, Which Path? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The young woman might not understand the magnitude of what they were seeing, but how could these older women now? In order to control the ice slide like Lionel had, he not only had to be able to control force outside of himself. In this world, this was something so rare that they didn't know how to put it into words. Lionel was oblivious to this, only doing what he needed to do to survive. But, he had already shocked the oldest women of them to such an extent that not only had her killing intent vanished, she looked toward Lionel with quite some interest. Of course, this interest had nothing to do with Lionel's looks, she was long past that age. And, even if she wasn't, she was trained enough not to show it on her face. No, this interest was something entirely different, and it only grew further when the butter knife began to glow. The older woman sat up, perched toward the edge of her seat. And then, Lionel's hands began to move. It felt like watching poetry in motion. Though, it mostly lacked substance. Lionel didn't have the skill to add artistic conception into something so complex, but what he did have was his dream world projection. When it came to copying, Lionel was even better than a computer. A camera would be limited by its lens and the number of pixels it could capture. How could it compare to the human eye? And, beyond that, how could the human eye possibly compare to internal sight? And, even a step beyond that, how could internal sight compare to Lionel's starry spirit domain? In just a few elegant strokes, the cube had already become a head. In a few more, it gained delicate feminine features. And, in just a few more, it was so obvious what the results would be that the young woman began clapping her hands excitedly, the pinkish hue of her irises dancing with life and vitality. Just a few minutes later, Lionel scooped up an empty plate and slid the head onto it, the gorgeous portrayal of a beautiful young lady being left behind. I hope you've enjoyed. I don't wish to intrude on your meal any longer, so I will be leaving now. Take this as a parting gift. Lionel bowed and stepped back, his hand already on the handle. He had no intention of pushing his luck any further. These women were far too dangerous. He was relieved that he had managed to get so far and thanked himself for his quick thinking. But, considering his style of dress, things could quickly get ambiguous if he stayed any longer. Plus, these women probably wanted him to leave sooner rather than later in order to avoid misunderstandings. He could be considered to have done his job. The young woman pouted, but she didn't say much. It seemed that she also knew that she had pushed this prank of hers a little too far this time, and since Lionel had already done his job and given her such a nice show, she might as well let him go. However, what Lionel didn't expect was for him to be stopped. Hold on a moment, lad. The old woman had quite a soothing voice, though hints of age and hoarseness could be heard within. Just looking at her, it wasn't difficult to accept that she had once been an astounding beauty in her youth, and she retained much of that even now, though she looked to be in her 50s. Yes, ma'am? Lionel asked politely. Have a seat. This old woman would like to ask you some questions. Lionel coughed lightly. Had he heard correctly? Him? Have a seat? What was going on here, exactly? He didn't sense any killing intent, but quite frankly, he would prefer if he could just leave now. He wouldn't be able to relax around these people and his senses were constantly primed. Still, without much of a choice, Lionel could only pull up a chair and sit, lamenting for the 100th time about his lack of a shirt. But, by this point, the old woman didn't seem to care. The others, though, also seemed to be curious about what was happening. What is your name? Lionel Morales. Oh. You have a last name? Lionel inwardly swore. Did this world have such customs? In some cultures he had studied, a last name was mostly something the nobility had. Usually, the commoners would only have their first name and nothing else. In such a society, last names were either bestowed by royalty or passed down through the lineage. This was why, often, being stricken from a family record had such a heavy negative connotation. It was akin to stripping your name from you. Of course, Lionel had always had the Morales name, so he didn't care much for the Luxnick's name. But, the picture was clear enough. Lionel's mind jumped into overdrive, trying to figure a way out of this situation. But, he knew that this old woman's thinking speed might very well be beyond his own, so he could wait too long or his lie would seem obvious. Luckily, the old woman had likely already gauged his strength and would give a small grace to him for his assumed weakness. It wasn't long before Lionel made a decision and his gaze flashed with a cold light the old woman easily caught. From what he had observed in this world, there was a lot of butting heads and strife. He also felt that the secret to the abyss was deeper than he knew. In that case, yes. That was Lionel's response, simple and to the point. And yet, it seemed to be exactly what the old woman wanted to see and hear. She nodded in understanding, her gaze seeming to soften somewhat. However, this reaction only made her next words all the more hypocritical. I see. Then what I'm asking of you now might be difficult for you to accept, but in your current situation, it's the only out I will allow you. Join my oligarch family or die. Which path do you choose? Chapter 1514. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:34 and 19 seconds p.m. Chapter 1514. We leave if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel's expression grew frigid, and this time, he didn't bother to conceal it. Before, it had been an act. He wanted the old woman to believe that he was indeed from a family with a last name, but also imply that this family had been destroyed. Lionel had made a bet that in a world like this one, such a thing wasn't rare at all. In fact, he wouldn't be surprised if in every city like this one, there was a constant overturning of the big shots. Just from walking the streets, he had sensed the division of power and the tension, and just by the fact this old woman's first instinct was to kill him rather than shoo him away, spoke volumes. This old woman was a veteran of this world, she had definitely seen a lot. Just reading her disposition and inclinations told Lionel all he needed to know. So, he assumed the identity of the final heir to a destroyed family. But, that was exactly why this old woman's ask of him was so disrespectful. Her words were very precise. She asked him to join her family and even named them for extra emphasis. She didn't ask him to work for her family, she didn't ask him to become a retainer or one of their guards, she asked him to join. She was asking the last member of a dead family to discard their duty and their name to become her little pet project. Put as bluntly as possible, she wanted Lionel to discard the Morales name and become an oligarch. This was something far worse than a slap to the face. She might as well have dug up his ancestors' graves and given each one of them one too. Despite seeing Lionel's expression, the old woman seemed unhurried and unbothered, even taking a sip of the tea she had before her until she realized that Lionel's little performance had actually taken the heat off quite a bit. Unfortunately, this small victory wasn't enough to do much for Lionel. This world didn't mean much to him, it was just a zone he would be doing everything in his power to get out of. However, the character he was playing had no choice but to react like this. Well, if Lionel were to say that it was all an act, that would be an outright lie. His name was given to him by his father, the man he respected most. And, even if he hadn't cared about his name that much, he didn't take too kindly to others disrespecting him. The young woman seemed stunned by the change in the situation, and even more stunned by Lionel's demeanor. She couldn't remember anyone ever daring to look at the old woman like that, ever. People were usually as quiet as mice around her, which was precisely why she thought that this prank would be so funny. Hey! Don't look at my grandma like that. What's so wrong with joining my family? Lionel completely ignored the young woman. He had already forgiven her once for ignorance, but now he was getting annoyed. She looked to be in her 20s. He really couldn't understand how she had made it so far while being such an airheaded brat. Seeing Lionel ignore her, the young woman almost flared up again, but she was doused by a gaze from her grandmother. Mistress Oligarch put her teacup down, her movements unhurried. She couldn't enjoy lukewarm tea, plus, she didn't really care about giving Lionel time to think. They had already been in this establishment for far too long and they had indulged her granddaughter's prank enough as well. She calmly rose to her feet. You will come with us. If you perform well, you will receive more chances. I can see that you've yet to be promoted to the 6th star, likely because your records of how to do so were lost along with your family. If not for this, I doubt a talent of your caliber would still be in the 5th star after all this time. Do your duty and you'll earn a path even to the charmed path. If you exceed my expectations, I might even give you a chance to court and marry my granddaughter. Lionel furrowed his brow. 6th star? What the hell was that? The young woman blinked before she suddenly registered her grandmother's words. In that instant, she flushed completely red. Grandma. Mistress Oligarch chuckled and walked over to ruffle her granddaughter's hair. We leave. Now. The other women stood quickly, following the old woman's lead. In the end, it seemed that there was no intention of giving Lionel a chance. The process of leaving the restaurant wasn't very difficult at all. Lionel was a new recruit to begin with, and Chef Luca seemed too scared even to raise his head too high. What Lionel didn't know, though, was that soon after they left, a squad dressed in deep blacks appeared, slaughtering everyone. Whether it was Chef Luca, Kara, or the mischievous Amory, all of them were now nothing more than corpses drowning in crimson alongside the customers they had been serving that day. Oblivious to this, Lionel could only make his way to the Olidarch estate, a large land near the very center of the city. No, it could be said that it was the center of the city, the very beacon of the land itself. Lionel was, of course, finally given a shirt. And this shirt also happened to make his dress pants and shoes quite well, turning him from half a male stripper to a respectable young man in a single bound. The young woman, whose name Lionel knew to be Athri by now, seemed to become far more reserved now. However, Lionel wasn't in the mood to be bothered with her at all because his situation only seemed to become worse. Upon entering the estate, he was ushered toward what they called their crafting hall, where he was unceremoniously tattooed with an odd mark on his shoulder blade. He grit his teeth as the energies that formed it drilled down through his skin and onto his bone and seemed to drain his force. Lionel's senses were far too sharp. After seeing the tattoo just once, he knew it was designed to track him. They really wanted to keep him in his place. Without even time to rest and recover, he was called to Mistress Olidarch once more. It seemed that she already had something for him to do. Chapter 15:15. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:34 and 17 seconds p.m. Chapter 15:15. Guarantees if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Check out my new novel, Spirit Beast Enlightenment. 20 chapters out already. I don't plan on contracting it to WN either, so there's a potential to read to the end for free and another option to pay off-site for advanced chapters whenever you want. Lionel entered what he assumed was Mistress Olidarch's office. However, despite seeing the older woman there, he didn't say a word, simply standing silently. He met her gaze and he even seemed to be quite relaxed. The coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a dull indifference, but his mind was constantly working at faster and faster speeds. He took in everything, sorted them, and then filed them away for a later date. Mistress Olidarch seemed to realize that Lionel had no intention of respectfully greeting her like most would, but the result only made her chuckle. The more stubborn you are, the more difficult this will be for you. It's really that simple. A smart boy like you should be able to understand this. Lionel didn't respond at all, his eyes meeting Mistress Olidarch's without a word. He wasn't a fool. In fact, if he fell in line so easily, rather than appreciating it, Mistress Olidarch would keep him even further away. Someone that couldn't control their own emotions was far less of a threat than someone who could change their face on a dime. Any talent of Lionel's caliber would have their own pride. If he could so easily ignore it the moment a juicy piece of meat was dangled before his face, then he wouldn't be worth much to begin with. Mistress Olidarch wanted him to both abandon his family name. And, to add insult to injury, she even said that the ultimate reward would be marrying her daughter. Setting aside the fact that Lionel had Aina and that brain-dead girl would drive him to an early death, what kind of man would want to marry into his wife's family? To become a live-in son-in-law? And that was supposed to be the ultimate reward? Plus, even if Lionel was so shallow as to go after Athri for nothing more than her beauty, could she even compare to Aina? She was still several points below his girlfriend, so Mistress Olidarch was far too arrogant to believe that her granddaughter was really so enticing. At that moment, Mistress Olidarch pulled out a document that seemed to be made of thick hide and unfurled it. On it, there were many words, a lot of which Lionel had already begun to understand now. He had about a 40% grasp of reading this language. He would probably need an extra 2 or 3 days to grasp it fully. That time frame could be made faster if he gained access to a library or a dense amount of text. But, he somehow doubted that he would get such an opportunity anytime soon. Sign it. Lionel's eyes narrowed. Signing something he couldn't fully understand? Absolutely not. There didn't seem to be any binding force arts on it, but Lionel still knew too little about this world to make a perfect judgment just yet. He felt that he was sensitive enough to pick up on such things, but he also had no idea what sort of abilities someone as powerful as this old woman might have. Plus, he didn't know what her ability index was either, and the abilities of this world seemed far different from the ones he had gotten used to, so he was currently in no man's land. For all he knew, she could bind him for life with this signature. However, after thinking to this point, Lionel calmed. If that was what this signature was for, then what would have been the point of the tattoo on his back? It made little sense to do both if one was so binding. Secondly, this might be an opportunity. Lionel remained unmoving, he didn't even glance at the outstretched pen. As time passed in silence, Mistress Olidark's light smile became colder and colder. This Lionel was truly testing her patience. It seems that if I don't teach you a lesson, you'll believe that you're truly unbendable, The pen flew forward with a flick of Mistress Olidark's fingers, a pressure exuding from it that made it impossible for Lionel to move. However, even with this being the case, Lionel never had the intention of moving in the first place. He stared at the flying pen. The moment it entered the current 6-inch range of his starry spirit domain, he had already pinpointed exactly where it would land and exactly how much damage it could do. Without even hesitating, he used dream sense, cutting off the nerves in the area from sending any signals to his mind. The pen seemed to be aimed right for his throat, but it veered away at the last moment, piercing right through his collarbone and splitting the bone in two. Mistress Olidark had expected Lionel to show a hint of when the pen aimed for his throat, and then fall in pain once his bone broke. However, he didn't even flinch. His gaze never left her eyes, staring her down as though he wanted to see if she would actually dare. The pen snapped back, ripping out of Lionel's collarbone and back into Mistress Olidark's hand. Blood dripped from the end, a pitter-patter sound echoing through the room as it fell onto the parchment paper. If you want me to sign anything, Lionel started coldly, then there had better be guarantees. I'm not going to sign away my name and my dignity just so that you can string me along for a few decades until I've run out of use to you. If that's your plan, you might as well try and kill me now. Try? Mistress Olidark's cold smile turned into a deeper sneer. Do you think you can even breathe if I don't allow you to? The files in the room rustled, a pressure the likes of which caused the room to shake. The force threatened to bring Lionel to his knees, but his gaze only continued to flicker with a hidden violet. Yes, you can try. Lionel's voice didn't waver, his coldness matching Mistress Olidark beat for beat. Chapter 1516. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:34 and 15 seconds p.m. Chapter 1516. Light and Dark Branch. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Check out my new novel, Spirit Beast Enlightenment. 20 chapters out already. I don't plan on contracting it to WN either, so there's a potential to read to the end for free and another option to pay off-site for advanced chapters whenever you want. Some time later, Mistress Olidark sat in her room alone, calmly stacking papers. At that moment, a seemingly insignificant shadow in the corner moved and morphed into a person. Is it done? Mistress Olidark asked. You shouldn't have allowed his leash to be so long, you will regret it, the figure cloaked in black spoke. Too long. Maybe it isn't long enough. He isn't useful to me as he is now. He won't even defeat even the weakest of all the live-in son-in-laws I've collected, let alone becoming the strongest of them. If I don't allow him some free rein, I might as well just kill him now like he said. Then let me kill him, you've given him too much. His benefits are even better than an elder's. Free access to all of our techniques and cultivation methods was a bridge much too far. Mistress Olidark chuckled. If you were in the 5th star right now and I stripped you of all the knowledge you had ever learned past that point, and then I gave you access to all the knowledge I have now, how long would it take you to be able to threaten me? The figure fell into silence. My level isn't one you can reach even if you have all the resources in the world, at least not with 100% certainty. At best, you would have a slightly better chance than most. And, even if the certainty was 100%, how long would it take you? 5 decades? A century? Even for my husband, it took at least this long, let alone for a brat who's already past his prime age for reaching the 6th star. Then you want him to be your spearhead? I want those who've forgotten the name Olidark only because my husband and my son-in-law have been gone for a decade to remember it. Aside from Sebastian and Slayton, the others I've brought into the family are far too lacking, and even those two aren't good enough. This family needs a man. You believe that he is a better option than those two? The figure seemed somewhat surprised. It was rare for a person like them to show any sort of emotion at all, so just this little bit might as well have been the equivalent of an avalanche to anyone else. Maybe, I'm still unsure. If what he's shown is all he has, then no. But if the answer is no, then giving him such a long leash is even less of a worry. But if I'm correct, and the answer is instead yes, then it's because he has something much deeper within him that I'm quite interested in. If this is your plan, then I assume you plan to use the ancestors' altar when the time comes. Are you sure you want to subject Athri to a life of marriage with a puppet? Mistress Olidark shook her head. That little girl has grown up too spoiled because she has no real talent of her own. Her only use is the Olidark blood that runs through her veins. With a talented husband, she might be able to produce an heir worthy of our family name. To do so is her duty. This life that she gets to live is built off the backs of the talents of the previous generations. She will also have to sacrifice something if she wants to be so carefree. The figure nodded. In fact, it didn't seem to actually care about Athri at all, it just wanted to hear exactly this response. The Olidark family was split into the light branch and the dark branch. The light branch was currently headed by Mistress Olidark while the dark branch was headed by the figure. They were both of the same family that had split many generations ago. In order to survive for as long as they had, a family needed a group of individuals with just as much vested interest in their success, who also happened to be willing to do the dirty work, and that was where the dark branch came into play. The truth was that the only ones who even knew of the existence of the dark branch were very select members of the light branch. This secret was one that was passed down in silence from generation to generation. Before, the figure had questions about whether their mistress would be strong-hearted enough to do what needed to be done. If the answer was no, then as they had done before, the dark branch would have to remove her and allow a branch family to come into their own. But the figure was very satisfied with the mistress' response. This was the character an Olidark should have. It was fine if the light branch had weakened somewhat. It couldn't be helped, the summons of those people could not be ignored, and it wasn't yet confirmed whether or not the former patriarch and their family's son-in-law had died yet. There was still a good chance they hadn't. Physical weakness was allowed. However, a weakness of the heart should be rooted out as quickly as possible. In fact, it was also because of this that the figure didn't oppose the long leash Lionel was given either. To be dauntless in front of death was exactly the kind of character an Olidark son-in-law should have. That said, I haven't let him off too easily. Mistress Olidark finished arranging her papers and stood. If he wants to take advantage of that long leash of his, he'll have to earn it. I've used a squad to keep an eye on him to make sure he doesn't get any funny ideas, but I'm sure he's smart enough to know that since I've released him so easily, I can reel him back in whenever I want. As Mistress Olidark had said, Lionel was already sent out of the estate on a mission. And, he could obviously guess that he would be monitored if he was being let go so easily. What wasn't easy was what he was tasked to do. He stood at the edge of a deep abyss, shaking his head. His collarbone had yet to heal, but he was being sent on a death mission. How fun. Chapter 15-17. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:34 and 13 seconds p.m. Chapter 15-17. Abyss. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel took a seat at the edge as though he couldn't sense anything around him. As expected, the abyss had wrapped all the way around the city. As for why, Lionel felt that he had a small understanding now after listening to Mistress Olidark. This city was placed here to protect what Lionel assumed was the world at large. As for what it was protecting the world from, it was down there, in the abyss. Lionel assumed that all of the cities were probably like this, protecting some sort of abyss from something. This sort of environment would also explain why everyone was always so high-strung and focused on power. They were, quite literally, on a battlefield. Mistress Olidark's exact words just a few minutes ago were, "My Trith city has been protected by my Olidark family for centuries. If you want Guanren fine, I'll give them to you. But, you won't receive them for nothing. Since you want to make this an equal exchange, we can do so. Everything you do will be done based on merits. You will be constantly monitored and your performance will dictate how much you receive. However, if you want to unlock these options, you'll have to bring me back the head of a 6-star demon. If you can't do that, you're not worth investing in." From these words, Lionel had made his deductions, and now he was sitting at the edge of the abyss. There were several people around him giving him odd looks, but they didn't say anything more and went about their business. This section of the city not only had chains running across, but they also had chains dangling down. Clearly, these chains were meant to be used to descend to whatever world was below. Lionel watched a group climb back up, beaten and haggard. One of them had lost an arm, and yet he was helping another who had lost a leg to walk. Yet, they were all grinning ear to ear, carrying bags of a bloody something. It was clear that whatever they had killed down there made the journey worth it for them. However, there were quite a number of teams that didn't have expressions that were nearly as happy. It was either they had lost someone precious to them, or their harvest wasn't as great. Just by observing this alone, Lionel was sure that there were huge numbers of groups that never returned at all. It was cruel. Lionel had thought that the Void Palace was already a cruel enough place, but at least that establishment was a gathering of geniuses, the best humanity had to offer. But from what it seemed here, no one had such a chance. The entire world was the front line when the enemies were right beneath your feet. It was a sobering thought, and it almost helped Lionel to understand Mistress Olidark's forcefulness. With such pressure constantly weighing down on you, how could you always worry about doing what was morally upright? Lionel himself had been grappling with this problem ever since he stepped foot into the dimensional verse, and yet his problems weren't nearly as severe as this. Or so it seemed. Lionel touched his collarbone. It was still very tender. His passive healing factor had done quite some work, but it wasn't enough. Of course, he could use, but he didn't want the Olidark family to know he had a trump card. If he could help it, he would only use what he had already shown them, his water force affinity and his spear force. He knew that he was likely being followed or monitored, he just didn't know how. So, he had to be cautious. Plus, he was about to enter a battlefield. Who knew if he would need to use within the next 24 hours? It would be foolish to waste it now. With his touch, Lionel winced a bit, but eventually shook his head. Freezing his collarbone now would actually make him heal more slowly. So, since he was about 20% healed, he might as well go now. Luckily, his collarbone was cracked to one side, so it was still manageable to use one arm even though it stung a bit. After making his decision, Lionel hopped down, his feet gliding along the chains. With every tap, he would slow down tremendously. But, the light around him only seemed to dim faster and faster. It was at a rate that didn't make very much sense, but the dark force in the surroundings only multiplied. That odd feeling Lionel had experienced before came back, trying to lull his mind into an odd trance-like state. But, in return, he only went faster and faster, focusing his mind more. Lionel had no idea how long he had fallen for, he was so focused on not losing his mind that his sense of time distorted. There was an odd coercive force in this place that was placing pressure even on his mind. Toward this, his frown could only deepen. Is this anarchic force? Why does it feel so much more powerful? Lionel exhaled a breath, his brow furrowing. The anarchic force he knew could eat away at his force, but it mostly left his mind alone. This force seemed to be able to do both, attacking his body and mind simultaneously. Just when Lionel was wondering if he should climb back up to regroup, the stars in his ethereal glabella rotated, cleansing away the force that attacked his mind and catching Lionel off guard. It had such an ability. Lionel was a bit stunned. If this was really anarchic force, nothing should be able to just wipe it away like that. What was happening? Lionel's feet suddenly hit solid ground. Caught off guard, his knees bent somewhat awkwardly, but he managed to catch himself. Lionel frowned. Looking around, it felt like everything was dark, his eyes could hardly see anything. He couldn't even see the chain that had been by the side of his own as he descended. After walking forward, Lionel's expression changed. The chain actually wasn't there at all. It was like the two chains had transported people to completely different regions despite being right next to one another. Just when Lionel was going to mark the location of his own chain so he didn't lose track of it, the growl of a beast licked at his shoulder and neck. Chapter 1518. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:34 and 12 seconds p.m. Chapter 1518. Demon World. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's expression went cold, his body flickering. Even without relying on his ethereal star force, the speed he could tap into with his body alone was far beyond what most could match. A spike of pain came from his collarbone, but with his dream sense, he would never allow it to impact his movement. At that moment, a sharp wind whistled by his neck and shoulder. The danger made Lionel's hair stand on end, but he still didn't see the result. However, just because he couldn't see it, doesn't mean he couldn't hear it. A whip-like mark cut across the ground, the grating sound of stone splitting entering Lionel's ears. Lionel tapped his foot on the ground, his speed accelerating once more as his palm flipped over to reveal his chain domain spear. In that moment, an absolute domain formed around him. His spear force acted like it had a mind of its own, springing to light like a flashbang of gold. A cycle of spear force spiraled to life, rotating with a vicious momentum ready to shred everything in its path to pieces. At the same instant, Lionel secretly tapped into his wisdom spirit branch, allowing his eyes to be replaced by that of the starry-tailed fox. His pupils dilated, a slightly brighter sheen taking hold of his irises. Though it was weaker than when he allowed himself to fully enter his fox form, it was far sharper than his normal vision. What he saw, though, made his eyes narrow once more. His spear force formed a wall of rotating golden energies. Beyond it, a grotesque humanoid beast-like creature fought against it, its flesh somehow strong enough to withstand it. It looked like a werewolf, but not. It stood on digitigrade hind legs, but its hands, or rather paws, had sharp claws that were each like scythes. Not a single one of them was shorter than 2 to 3 feet. It had a long snout like a wolf, but it also had a mane like a lion. Well, if a lion replaced all its hair with a dense black fire instead, that is. Its crimson gaze stared at Lionel through the rotating cyclone of spear force, its scythe-like claws trying to rip a path through. Lionel's expression turned cold. Piss off. Forceful. Lionel's spear pierced forward, his blade unceremoniously tearing a hole through the werewolf's fire mane and leaving its neck in pieces. The werewolf demon beast's crimson eyes widened, before it fell to the side. It didn't think that Lionel would actually be so powerful. However, what made Lionel's heart grow cold was the fact he didn't see any fear of death in the creature's eyes. There was only surprise at Lionel's strength and nothing more. It was as though it never really cared about its life in the first place. The shadows watching Lionel's progress also paused in surprise. Even for someone in the 6th star, taking out a 5-star demon in a single strike was not a simple feat. Demons were far more exaggerated creatures than beasts, they tended to be much more powerful than their base realms would dictate. Lionel's head snapped in their direction, his cold gaze squinting somewhat. The shadows didn't move an inch. They had slipped up once, but they were extremely professional. It was just that Lionel's feat was far too surprising. This was definitely something they would have to report later. In their estimation, so long as they didn't move, Lionel would eventually believe that he had made a mistake and turn away. And, sure enough, Lionel turned away again after frowning slightly. Still, they couldn't help but be inwardly shocked again. Such a small slip-up wasn't something that a 5-star should have been able to see through either. What they missed, though, was Lionel's sneer after he turned away. He had been making it a point not to show too much of his strength. But this was still within the realms of acceptability. He would be fine so long as he only continued to lean on his water force and spear force. However, he had purposely made that strike as dazzling as possible for two reasons. First, he wanted to learn of the standards of this world, and he also wanted to expose those following him. Now that he knew where they were, they could forget about continuing to hide from him. So long as he knew exactly where they were, he would be able to protect his life better without being too restricted. He could take advantage of their perspective to hide more of his strength, while simultaneously not being worried about displaying a bit more of it. Lionel shot forward. In such a dark area, he had definitely released far too bright of a light. He was practically yelling and screaming to every threat that he was right here. He made sure to note where the chain was. While he trusted his sense of direction, the fact the adjacent chain had disappeared told him that there was more to this world than he thought. Surprisingly, though, the darkness didn't remain for long. Lionel went from being shrouded in a perpetual black to entering a work of red-black a moment later. Up ahead, there was a land of mountains and hills. The earth was a dark red and the skies were a black violet. The clouds had a weird bluish hue to them that made it feel like the fog of a hallucinogenic drug. Lionel's head snapped back and he found a curtain of blackness. The abrupt change was jarring and didn't make much sense, but Lionel deduced that this was likely something that kept the city and the above world protected. He was correct. Only humans and demons beneath the 6th star could pass through this seemingly flimsy curtain of black. But this also meant that Lionel was in the true world of demons now. Lionel's steps pushed forward, entering a forest of dead and black trees, looking for his target. However, his goal was deeper than just this. Chapter 1519. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:34 and 10 seconds p.m. Chapter 1519. 6-star demon. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Happy New Year everyone. Hope your 2023 is a million times better than your 2022. I will be taking a one-day break tomorrow and will be back the following day with more chapters. Lionel stepped over another corpse, his gaze incomparably focused. There was a large population of 5-star demons in this region. He seemed to run into another one every few dozen meters. Every time he took one down, he tried to see if there was anything special about them, or maybe something that connected them, but the answer seemed to be no. What he didn't know was that the shadows that were following him all had weird expressions. They had never seen someone so casually ignore demon corpses like that. Did he not know the value of them? Or did he really not care? 5-star demon corpses were very useful even into the 6th star, only 7-star individuals wouldn't bother to give them a second glance. Well, either that, or the true geniuses of the 6th star. Of course, they had no idea that Lionel truly didn't know. Lionel knew that he was being watched, so he was trying to find a method of stealthily finding out what he needed. If he couldn't, that much would be fine too. After he gained access to the oligarch family's library, he would find out one way or another. It wasn't that difficult for him to kill these demons to begin with. It was at times like this that the range of his starry spirit domain being so short was truly a problem. If he just had a meter or two, then he could envelop the demon corpse entirely. Then, he could enter it perfectly into his dream's simulation, then use a dream clone to check several methods of making use of these corpses. So long as the process wasn't too involved or require anything too complicated, it would only take him a few seconds to figure out why these demons were so valuable. Unfortunately, he couldn't do this, and there wasn't anything that seemed to tie these demons together. They all were of varying sizes and strengths. They used different methods to attack. They didn't even look the same. After the first werewolf demon, they ran into a spider demon, a snake demon, and he had even run into a weird-looking whale demon that quite legitimately looked like a whale with 2 powerful legs. How could he find any patterns like this? Lionel's steps paused, his heartbeat becoming more solid and sustained. Up ahead, there were 2 demons. No, more accurately, there was one demon and the other was nothing more than a ravaged corpse. Lionel had never laid his eyes on something so eerie in his life. It was a beautiful creature. Or, rather, it should have been. It was a unicorn with a beautiful white mane and silver hooves. From the back, it looked like it had come right out of a fairy tale. However, when Lionel got closer, he noticed that it was nothing short of a nightmare. Its neck and part of its torso was split in two. Grotesque vines wiggled out from the oval-shaped bloody hole, dripping with a sticky, viscous, and clear liquid. The mouth of the unicorn demon was filled with 3 rows of sharp teeth. Every time it bent down, it ripped out another chunk of the demon beneath it, chewing with a sickening look of satisfaction in its eyes. It seemed that Lionel had found his first 6-star demon. The shadows watched this scene with their own gazes focused. Would he run? That was their first thought. Lionel didn't understand anything about demons, but they knew beautiful demons like this were among the most dangerous. The less demon-like they were, the more powerful they were. As for why this was, no one was entirely sure. Or, at least those of their level had no idea. Even if this was just a Tier 1 6-star demon, it was more dangerous than even most mid-level demons. In their opinion, Lionel's luck was terrible. Even if he chose to run, it was probably already too late. Even though the demon didn't seem to have noticed Lionel yet, it had likely already sensed him long ago. However, much to their shock, clang, clang, clang. Lionel didn't bother to even try and hide his presence, a dense frosty aura radiating from him. With every step he took, another patch of ice appeared on the ground. It looked like he was paving a road of glowing blue, a color that made his pale violet hair and eyes look all the more pleasing to the eye. You're pretty powerful, huh? Lionel spoke to seemingly no one but himself, his smile cold. It wasn't a guarantee that the demon could even understand what he was saying as it finally looked up from its meal, curious about why this small human wasn't running. How about you play with me a bit, then? Lionel stretched out his spear with a hand, the point beginning to glow with a furious golden light. The unicorn demon bared its teeth, all 3 rows glistening with blood, saliva, and chunks of flesh. Lionel didn't seem to care about its answer. With another step, he vanished. But the reaction of the unicorn demon wasn't slow in the slightest, the tentacles wiggling in the gaping hole shooting forward to intercept him. Clang! 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 Lionel's spear pierced outward with an unconscious speed, leaving after images in the air. It almost looked like he too had dozens of tentacles attacking at once. To his astonishment, the tentacles of the unicorn were both flexible and as sturdy as blades. Every collision felt heavy and nothing like flesh at all. Lionel's gaze flashed. Swift. Clang. 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 A curtain of gold seemed to cascade from Lionel, his speed reaching the point that the unicorn demon suddenly found all of its tentacles slapped into various directions. Before it could react, Lionel had appeared before it, his spear aiming right for its brows. At that moment, the unicorn demon released a low growl, its singular horn and its silver hooves beginning to glow a beautiful bright crystalline color. Its head lowered, its horn intercepting Lionel's blade. Bang! A strong force ripped Lionel from his feet, sending him flying backward like a speed bullet. At the same time, the wave of tentacles recovered, chasing after him with an aura of bloodlust multiplying around them. Chapter 1520. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:34 and 8 seconds p.m. Chapter 1520. Composition. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel felt his arm threaten to fracture. As he flew back through the air, his eyes couldn't help but narrow. What a powerful creature. That was the first time Lionel's swift spear had actually been repelled. In fact, Lionel felt that if he had used forceful instead, he would have fractured his own arm on impact. Without his bronze runes activated, his body lost quite a bit of its durability. However, Lionel didn't seem panicked in the slightest. His feet hit the ground, his cold and indifferent gaze locking onto the surging tentacles. It seemed that this unicorn demon was getting quite confident. It even wanted to end this battle early so that it could return to its meal. It probably even had thought of adding Lionel to that count. Lionel's lips curled into a sneer. He didn't like feeling like things weren't fully in his control, and if there was anything the last few days had been, it was out of his control. His mood wasn't the best right now. He was being followed by scuttling rats. The fate of his mother and his girlfriend were unknown. And now, he had no idea when he would be able to pull himself out from beneath the thumb of Mistress Olidark. This unicorn demon had picked the wrong time to come across. He no longer cared about the tender feeling in his collarbone. Lionel didn't move an inch, watching as though tentacles continued to fly toward him. But just as they entered a 5-meter range, his absolute domain activated once again, but this time, it was like a raging tornado of golden flames, shredding everything in its path apart. Fury. Applying concepts of fury to his spear force made it break apart like a volatile flame, even taking on slight characteristics of Lionel's Scarlet Star Force. There was no one in this world who could possibly understand the core meaning of fire better than Lionel could. He embraced it all, taking a step forward, and disgusting globules of violet and black flesh and blood fell around him. Lionel brandished his spear, just the slightest violet glow appearing. His hair whipped about in the surging energy, his pale violet eyes and hair jumping to life. Slumbering in silence. Erupting at will. It was a simple string of 6 words, their meaning deep and unfathomable. In speaking them, Lionel's voice seemed to layer as though 2 entities were speaking at once, his cadence falling by several octaves with each syllable he spoke. If one thought that Lionel took 10 months to learn just 3 words, they would be sorely mistaken. Lionel hadn't been satisfied to rest until he had fully comprehended the strength of calligraphy and poetry. Now fueled by his projected artistic conception, the substance of his words held the weight of the world, unbridled and unfettered, unbothered and unhurried, untouchable and unquenchable. The strike seemed to tear the world in two, even the high dark clouds above stirring. The earth quaked and the black trees in the surroundings were ripped from the ground, their roots taking with them large swaths of earth as they were blown away. Lionel's spear quivered in excitement. As though a roaring flood dragon ready to break out of its cocoon, its tip vibrated with its own and its body radiated a shimmering dark light. In one moment, Lionel was dozens of meters from the unicorn demon. In the next, he appeared to its back, his hair slowly fluttering down from its raised state. The furious light in his eyes persisted for a while longer, the elegant line he had drawn across the air still shaking the hearts of all those who had seen it. It was fear. That single strike elicited a fear that they hadn't felt in a long while, a fear that they thought they had weeded out the moment they had stepped into the position in the dark branch. However, this child strike had brought it back. At that moment, they realized that they had never gotten fear of that part of themselves, they had just managed to bury it deep. Right then, the neck of the unicorn demon imploded, its head flying into the air and its body collapsing to the ground. Like this, a powerful demon collapsed to the ground, felled in a single strike. Lionel looked back. He didn't seem surprised by the result. His spear force was far stronger after a year than most knew. Maybe only he, himself, was aware of just how far he had gone. By this point, he could compose at will and execute it on a whim. So long as the word was in his base of prepared vocabulary, he could use it as pleased and then break it down and reconstruct it into a new phrase, sentence, or composition. To others, it would look as though Lionel had access to an endless supply of spear techniques, each more vibrant and powerful than the last, and most definitely more difficult to handle. The subtle conception was beyond what most could handle on a whim. At this point, Lionel didn't even feel any desire to learn any spear or bow techniques. He could make his own, forming them and stacking them into powerful combinations of words his enemies could only hope to match. Lionel put his spear away, picking up the unicorn demon's head up by its silver horn. However, at the moment he touched it, his expression flickered. This feeling, it was like he was touching an ore. With his Earth-variant affinity, he was very certain of this, he couldn't possibly be mistaken. It was quite interesting. This meant that the bones of this unicorn demon could form metals of its own, something similar to the Morales family's lineage factor, metal synergy. Lionel didn't recognize this metal, so it was probably a composite of several the unicorn demon had absorbed. Since this was a zone, the metals should be the very same as what he had already long since memorized, so he was at least 90% sure of this. It would be 100%, but this zone was simply too odd. At that moment, another oddity occurred. Lionel felt his metal synergy lineage factor stir. Chapter 1521. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:34 and 6 seconds p.m. Chapter 1521. A moment. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's brows jumped. He had experienced this feeling before. It happened when his snowy star owl lineage factor of the past entered the vicinity of the bronze tablet. Of course, the bronze tablet was stuck wherever the segmented cube's inner space was, along with the silver tablet, so they couldn't have caused this. Plus, this was obviously the head of a demon and not a tablet. So why would his lineage factor stir? From Lionel's limited understanding, this stirring represented a potential for evolution. Could it be that the Morales family signature lineage factor also had room to evolve? Lionel shook his head, unable to confirm this. He didn't know how a demon head would help with such a thing. It might be related to the value of these demon corpses, but he was unsure. Lionel didn't want to rashly do anything, not without first understanding the situation. His snowy star owl lineage factor had an obvious progression path. But if it really was the case that this demon head carried such a secret, it wasn't something that Lionel would casually do. His metal body was one of his greatest assets. What if this mutation or evolution hindered him from using it? What about his divine armor, another hugely important part of his battle prowess? Plus, his metal synergy lineage factor had technically already mutated once before. Not only was there a subtle connection between it and his king's might lineage factor, but there was also the red energy it gave off to consider as well. From what Lionel understood, this mutation was likely caused due to the fact he had almost failed his first awakening phase. This was mostly his fault, since he had attempted to do it before he had even formed all of his nodes, something that was ridiculous. This was to say that he had already deviated once and was lucky enough that things still stayed relatively on track. If he allowed it to mutate again, it was impossible to say if he'd get lucky again. Even if the result was a more powerful lineage factor, its overall effectiveness might be far inferior due to a lack of compatible techniques. This was a problem that Lionel was currently facing, actually. He hadn't had the time to analyze the bronze tablet, so he hadn't been able to unearth the pairing techniques for his starry-tailed fox lineage factor. The good news was that this lineage factor was so far and beyond the snowy star owl that it was still worth it. But there was no telling whether it would be the same with his metal synergy lineage factor. Lionel finished his thoughts in just a few seconds. With one hand, he hoisted the unicorn demon's corpse over his shoulder, letting its hooves drag along the ground. Several eyes couldn't help but be drawn to Lionel. He hopped to the top of the abyss, his feet gliding up the side as though it was solid ground. Now that he could confidently rely on his stars to repel the anarchic force, he was no longer worried about the attack on his mind and didn't take the chains seriously any longer. However, just because he didn't mean others also wouldn't. The contrast between Lionel and the others was far too great. When they saw that he had actually slayed a unicorn demon, many forgot to breathe, the suffocating aura of even the dead creature being too much for them to handle. The aura shrouded Lionel as well, making many miss the fact that he was actually in the 5th star. If they were able to focus enough to see through this, it was unknown just how much larger the uproar was. They all had their ingrained biases. Most people knew that the 6th star was the minimum requirement you should meet to even dare to venture into the demon world. No one even considered the fact that Lionel wouldn't ignore this rule. In fact, many believed that he might even be a legendary 7 star. Lionel didn't care about the stairs, his steps steady as he walked right through the city and toward the oligarch family's estate. No one even dared to stop him despite the fact that this was proper protocol. The gates of the oligarch family estate were always open. Why close them when no one would dare to casually stroll in to begin with? Maybe that was why Lionel's appearance was all the more shocking on that day. Several of the guards, servants and members of the family were stunned into silence. With how large the compound was, Lionel had to follow a long path with grassy pastures, noble statues and several ponds and fountains to his left and right. Yet, he didn't seem to care about the beauty of it at all as the ghastly blood of the demon over his shoulder continued to drip. At that moment, Athri walked out of the large doors of the main house with a wide smile on her face. To her side, a young man wearing a smile also walked. He was quite handsome, his black hair tinged with what seemed like a hint of blue much darker than the radiant blue of his irises. He had a subtle cadence to his footsteps that made it quite clear that he was an expert in his own right, or in anyone's right, for that matter. When Athri looked up to see Lionel and the demon on his back, she released a high-pitched screech, immediately jumping to hide behind the young man. She grabbed at his arm, quivering and not daring to look forward again. She had never seen such a sight in her life and had been sheltered since her birth. How could she stand the sight of such a ghastly corpse? Lionel, though, who never had a favorable impression of this young woman to begin with, simply dropped the corpse and head and the foot of the stairs, climbing up and passing by the young man and Athri without a word. He didn't even seem to notice their presence. Just as he was about to walk in, though, the young man suddenly called out. "A moment, if you please," he said lightly. Chapter 1522. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:34 and 3 seconds p.m. Chapter 1522, LC. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The young man sounded polite enough, so Lionel turned back. Although he didn't have a great relationship with the oligarch family, that didn't mean that he had to be hostile to everyone in it. Anya's words still seemed to play at the back of his mind from time to time. The young man smiled when he got Lionel's attention. "This is a bit inappropriate, don't you think?" he continued, his head pointing toward the demon corpse. It was indeed inappropriate no matter how you looked at it. To leave a corpse in front of the oligarch's family estate, were you trying to wish ill upon the family? In fact, it wasn't even at the front of the estate, but the door to the main home. It was even more exaggerated. I think it would be more appropriate for you to clean this up. I can also see that you've caused quite a mess on your way here. The workers have their hands full every day as this is quite a large estate to care for. We shouldn't casually give them more work like this. Also, I hope that you would also apologize to Miss Athri. Your actions startled her. Lionel turned back and opened the door, disappearing into the home. The young man fell into silence. He didn't seem too shocked and he didn't even look angry. He seemed quite difficult to read. Even after the door closed, he didn't say much, looking back toward the unicorn demon corpse. Still, although he didn't say much, didn't mean that Athri wouldn't. She stomped her feet angrily, her cheeks practically puffing as though she was a toddler. She didn't look like much of a young lady at all. Or, maybe she looked exactly like one depending on how you viewed such noble young women. He's always so rude. The young man looked back to Athri. He already had some guesses of his own, but Athri's words seemed to expose some more stuff. He was actually a bit curious about a person who was clearly here in the same capacity as himself, but dared to be so rude to Athri. "Do you know him?" "Of course I know him. He's just a bunny." Athri was about to expose Lionel as a male escort, but she suddenly remembered her grandmother's stern reprimand from earlier. Her grandmother rarely got so cold with her, but whenever she did, it was very important. "Bunny?" The young man raised his eyebrows. "Forget it, he was just a servant yet he's so arrogant. Grandma invited him into the family, but he actually dared to glare at Grandma." The young man's heart skipped a beat. What had Athri just said? He tended to believe what the young mistress was saying, but in that case, why was Lionel still alive? For the first time, he became serious. He's so full of himself. He thinks he's so great just because he looks a little good. Of course, he doesn't look as good as you, Slayton. He just has an overinflated ego. Slayton smiled lightly at this, but didn't say much. Objectively, there was no gap between his looks and Lionel's. They were both quite handsome. Clearly, Athri just didn't like Lionel, and it seemed more due to the fact that he had been rude to her rather than because Lionel had been rude to her grandmother. Interesting. Anyway, let's go. You promised to take me out of the estate today. I didn't get to have all my fun last time. What did you say? Mistress Olidark's uninterested expression changed. She looked up toward the shadow making the report. In the end, the shadow could only reiterate what happened. A single spear strike for a 5-star demon. That much is shocking, but still acceptable within the realms. A single spear strike for a tier 1 6-star middle demon while in the 5th star. Mistress Olidark didn't know how to accept this information. She asked question after question, but in the end, the only response the shadow seemed to have for her is that it looked like a profound spear technique. A profound spear technique could bridge the gap between the 5th and 6th star. Mistress Olidark didn't know how to take this. Did you find information on this Morales family? From the moment she learned of this family name, she had sent the Dark Branch on a task. But when it came to destroyed families, she had to be exceptionally cautious. The web of ties and interests associated with such a fall could become very complex, very quickly. And now, judging from this technique, it might be even more complicated than she had originally thought. The more powerful this Morales family, the more trouble there could be lurking in the shadows. If it was bad enough, Mistress Olidark would even have to cut her losses and kill Lionel directly. If Lionel brought their family more trouble than help, then there was no use in keeping him around. Raising up the only remaining heir of a destroyed family, especially if that family was powerful, was like raising a ticking time bomb. We have been cautious, making sure that no one can follow our traces, so progress is slow. We haven't found anything yet. It likely will be several months before we find anything. I see. In all likelihood, since the brat dared to appear here and even speak out his family name, it's either he's arrogant and overestimates himself, or that there are no enemies that can threaten him here. Forget it for now, let him reap his rewards and keep him happy. The more he works, the better. Before he knows it, he'll be helping our Olidark family far more than he's taking from us. The shadow nodded and turned to leave. Left to her own devices, Mistress Olidark's gaze narrowed, her mind still on the profound spear technique. If it was good enough, she would also force Lionel to hand it over. Since they were sheltering him, the price he paid couldn't be allowed to be too small. Chapter 1523. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:34 and 1 p.m. Chapter 1523, Dream Unify. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Sorry for the super late chaps everyone, I didn't like how Chapter 2 and 3 came out originally, so I rewrote them since they were important. Anywho, onward. Lionel entered the library of the Olidark family without even checking in with Mistress Olidark. He didn't feel the need to show such courtesy. He had done his job, now it was time to reap the rewards they would very soon regret giving him. If they thought that restricting his reading time would really work, they were sorely mistaken. Very few had ever outright guessed what Lionel's ability was. And, as his lineage factors grew more powerful, it got even more difficult to tell. Those of the dimensional verse had an easier time because they knew which families he was born from and could, as such, deduce which of his strengths came from them. But those in this zone clearly had no idea, or so Lionel hoped. This world was too unlike the one he was used to. Since this was a zone, it was definitely a point in history at some time or another. So, the idea that a Morales family could exist here wasn't impossible. But Lionel just wasn't sure. The main reason for his confusion was precisely their naming convention for the dimensions. A name might sound insignificant, but after what Lionel learned about constellations, he started to pay more attention to them. Also, even if he didn't care to do this, the change was far too jarring. Lionel was no longer the ignorant pup he had been in the beginning. After reading so many books from the Void Library, his knowledge foundation was far too solid. This was why he knew that in the history of the human domain, no one had ever called the dimensions stars. This was a jarring realization alone, one that Lionel was firmly grappling with. It was something he obviously had to accept, but it was also just as hard to do so. The implications weren't something that he even knew how to wrap his head around. There was, of course, the possibility that this wasn't the human domain at all. He had only seen a small segment of this world, after all. What if there were other races acting as overlord? P1E's visit N0VE1B, in T. The issue was, he had never heard of demons either. Such creatures, especially since they seemed so tied to the anarchic force of this world, should have definitely been detailed in the Void Library. After all, it had detailed every other race. Plus, there was the fact that this anarchic force was far more powerful than what Lionel was used to, even being capable of attacking the mind. How could there be anarchic force more powerful than what you could find on a void battlefield? It didn't make sense. There was an obvious answer to all of this. This was a mythological zone. It was the only answer that made sense to Lionel, and he gave it a better than 97% probability to be the case. This had to be a mythological zone based on a myth of the human domain, one that Lionel wasn't familiar with. It's not like the Void Library would house fairy tales in it, so it was very much possible that Lionel wouldn't be aware of it. Since Lionel was born and raised on Earth, there were many obvious things to others that probably wouldn't be so obvious to him. Lionel shook his head. Regardless of what this place was, he needed more information. And he would have to source that information from this place. The Audiobook library was quite bright. It had a dome of glass as though it was a greenhouse rather than a library, and it had countless shelves, even the shortest of which were twice Lionel's height. These short shelves were located on the far walls, though. The main shelves were grandly used as centerpieces, towering upwards of 20 or so meters and of dozens of ladders between them to accommodate those that might want to reach books near the top. The library was separated into general knowledge sections and technique sections, the latter second giving off a much more profound pressure in Lionel's direction. Lionel was given exactly 1 hour for his efforts. Though no one had stopped his march here, he was absolutely certain that they were monitoring this. They wouldn't let him take any more, lest they believe him to be getting too full of himself. Such a large store of knowledge couldn't possibly be consumed in just an hour. They expected Lionel to have to work harder and harder for his time and his benefits. Practically the only thing they would give him for free was food, water, and a place to stay, with no guarantee for any of them to be worth much of anything. Well, a normal person, anyway. This wasn't the Void Library that forced Lionel to construct and organize his own network. This was a library, already properly organized, and written not even on pendants, but on sheets of paper. It was almost too easy. Lionel walked to the first shelf and ran his fingers along the books, looking at the spine of each one as though he was looking for something in particular. An hour later, he had touched every book in the library and he walked out just as the final second ticked down. There might as well have not been anyone else around him, as he didn't spare any of them a single glance. In fact, there were even times he walked up to individuals already reading a book just to check the cover without a word. He didn't know why this world that seemed so much more powerful was using such primitive methods, but he also didn't care. Even if they had used pendants, it would have been just as easy. Lionel didn't give anyone the opportunity to reprimand or find fault with him. He simply left, turning through several corridors and hallways until he found his supposed room once again. The door clicked closed behind him and fell to the floor, snoring away without a care. As he slept, his mind quickly organized itself, his mind of fluttering books moving about as though they had minds of their own. Dream unify. Chapter 1524. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:33 and 59 seconds p.m. Chapter 1524. Fated if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The ease was too great. Lionel had a half-foot radius around his body in which his starry spirit domain could function without activating his bloodline. All he needed to do was touch something, and so long as it was compact enough, it would functionally, for all intents and purposes, be within his dream world. And once that happened, everything was fair game. Lionel no longer had to consciously use Dream Sculpt to transfer something into his dream world now. This saved him time, effort, and stamina. On top of this, he was also able to copy things that would have usually been far beyond his means in the past as well. All that was left now was to organize them, and that was where Dream Unify came into being. Sleeping was the ultimate organization effort. Lionel realized that rather than wasting time doing it all himself, he could allow the natural functions of his body to take hold of its own processes. With the middleman cut out, not only would he be able to rest, but the process would also be far faster. Like this, the first dream ability where Lionel would truly be asleep was born. And just like that, his mind began to whir at seemingly inhuman speeds, rapidly categorizing everything into memories as though he had personally read it all. When it was done, Lionel opened his eyes. He entered the shower, washed him of the demon blood that had covered him, and then sat cross-legged on his bed. His expression was frighteningly cold, the picture of concentration. Even the temperature of the room seemed to plummet. But that all vanished when he closed his eyes. The knowledge assimilated into Lionel and he exhaled a long breath. The first thing he looked toward was the information about demons. According to this, demons came in different ranks. The one he had just fought was known as a middle demon. Lower, middle and higher demons were all collectively known as low-class demons. Beyond low-class demon were, unsurprisingly, middle-class demons. They were separated into uncommon demon, rare demons, and elite demons. These demons usually had real names and species to go with them and were less reliant on sudden mutation. They also tended to be more beautiful. One would think that this was all, but beyond this there were still high-class demons, humanoid demons, fiend demons, and chaos demons. Each of which had divisions of their own, enough for 18 subclasses, with each one having a large gap between them. Lionel found this especially hard to wrap his head around. If a low-class demon was actually so powerful, then what about a middle-class demon? What about a humanoid demon? A chaos demon? Lionel might have defeated the unicorn demon in just a single strike, but he had used at least 30% of his strength. While this might shock the oligarch family, to him this meant that he was far too lacking. There were definitely people in this world capable of fighting these demons, or else the human race would have already long since been overrun. Just by Lionel's initial calculations, if he needed 30% of his strength already, that meant that at best, right now he could fight a tier 1 6-star uncommon demon. He didn't have a chance against a rare demon, let alone a high-class demon or beyond. And that was if he could go all out. Of course, Lionel was still in the 5th dimension. Or, rather, the 5th star. But he felt that even if he had a perfect breakthrough, the best he'd be able to do was face the best of the high-class demons. At the same level. He really didn't think he'd be a match for a humanoid demon of the lowest level, and there were still 8 more subclasses to go. Just what was this world? This wasn't a matter of raw strength, this was a matter of talent. Pure talent. The reason Lionel couldn't fight these demons wasn't because they were more powerful, it was because they were far more talented than him. And, by proxy, this meant that there were also humans here far more talented than him. Lionel suddenly felt a tingling sensation. Even though his eyes were still closed, his lips couldn't help but spread into a grin. It was a wild, unrestrained grin that only seemed to grow wilder by the second. How interesting. When Wise Star Order told him that there were plenty of people out there that were more talented than him, he had believed it. But when he entered the Void Palace, he was fairly disappointed. His excitement came, but then it fizzled out just as quickly. Things just became uninteresting to him. If it wasn't for the Green Thread faction antagonizing him, he probably wouldn't have bothered with much other than preparing himself for the air war. After all, Lionel had yet to revive his friends and he still had a lot of work to do toward building a faction in the future. He didn't have time to play petty games. Though, defeating the Green Thread faction would have actually netted him quite a bit and thus made it worth it. Still, Lionel had resigned himself to that boredom. Of course, Lionel had also yet to meet the true geniuses of the Void Palace. He hadn't met the previous Amethyst token wielders, nor had he fought Amory at his full strength, and he also hadn't faced off against the members of his generation after they broke through to the sixth dimension. But he still could only deal with what was right in front of him. And nothing that had been in front of him excited him aside from his grandfather's way of the spear. Ironically, though, his mastering a portion of that only made things more boring. Now, though, Lionel couldn't help but realize that if he hadn't mastered calligraphy, what would have become of him? Let alone a middle-class demon? Would he have even been capable of defeating a low-class demon? The appearance of this zone had been so abrupt and sudden, there was no time to prepare. He was simply thrust into this situation without cause or warning. What if his uncle had let him run away that day? Or what if this zone appeared a year earlier? Lionel's grin faded. The problem with his mindset seemed to become more glaring to him every day. Chapter 1525. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:33 and 57 seconds p.m. Chapter 1525, 1 month. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel knew that it wasn't his ice control that had gotten Mistress Olidark's attention. It might have caused her to perk up a bit, but it wasn't until he displayed his spear force that she decided against killing him and took him in. For all Lionel knew, if he hadn't learned this way of the spear, he would have been killed on the spot, never to see the next day. It was quite a sobering thought. No. LBI. A part of Lionel still believed that he would have found a way to escape. But as a person who claimed to be so rational, these thoughts of his were wholly irrational. He didn't even realize that he had had such inner thoughts until Aina pointed them out to him, but now it felt so obvious. It was no wonder his dad laughed at him when he talked about being a king. A king, of course, needed confidence. But didn't that confidence need to be built on something? Lionel thought that he was. After all, his mind was his most powerful asset. He believed that he could think and smart his way out of any situation even if he lacked the raw strength. Even his dream class ratings were based on this. But wasn't that all theoretical? Lionel opened his eyes and looked out of the window. There was no sky, no clouds, hardly any sunlight. It was just a wall to what was probably another big house or mansion in the estate, an estate that was essentially nothing more than a cage to him. Lionel suddenly remembered that day on the battlefield. Heavy rain fell from the skies. One by one, friends that he had held so dear for 2 years fell, their blood mixing into the mud and returning to the earth. Every death was like an added weight on his shoulder, a deeper sort of promise that he swore to keep. But what if that was the real world? There would be no reviving them. It would be too late to regret his weakness. Right now he was stuck in this world, stuck in this cage. His mother was out there. The woman he loved was out there. His brothers were out there. And he was here because he was too weak to leave to go to find them. They said that the human mind was good at forgetting and glossing over tragedy. It was also pretty good at forgetting that one day we'd all die, something that quite a scary proposition, entering an unknown abyss on the other side, and yet people still managed to live day to day with a smile on their faces. Lionel thought that he was different. He believed himself to be some logically superior being. Even his moral compass was kept dear to him as though he was blessing the world with his kindness. He couldn't find a reason to place the worth of his life above another, so he might as well consider himself their equals. It made him sound like a prick when you put it like that. And maybe he was one. Clearly he wasn't much different from anyone else. That traumatic day he experienced in the Valiant Heart Zone, that day when all his thinking, all his planning, all his logic, all his intelligence, all his smarts was worth not a damn thing, he seemed to have just casually forgotten it. And why? All because he could just revive them with a tablet? It was quite funny when he thought about it. He couldn't find a reason to place one life above another, but didn't this tablet that could revive the dead do so easily? Wasn't there a different energy requirement for reviving each person? If there was no intrinsic worth, then wouldn't they all be worth the same price? Why did he still care then? His life was worth more than theirs, and these high-class demons were worth more than him. What was the point, anymore? This tablet could obviously accomplish something he could not, so clearly it knew better than him about the secrets of life. Wasn't that the logical conclusion? With his intelligence, shouldn't he have thought of that problem long ago? So why had he rejected it? Lionel turned his head away from the window and closed his eyes once more. He took deep and steady breaths. He never really hesitated to give worth to people. Most would hesitate to say which parent or child they loved more, and yet Lionel felt pretty clearly that he favored his dad. Most would never sit idly by as the woman they loved was married off to another man, and yet he had, and he was even smiling in his own little world all the while. Most wouldn't try to logically understand things that were clearly beyond their means, and yet he tried to do so all the time. It was like he was also trying to fit puzzle pieces into places he knew they didn't fit, stubbornly and arrogantly jamming them in again and again, yet still being unsatisfied with the result. What did all of this mean? What was the answer? Where had he gone wrong? Or was he even wrong at all? Lionel didn't have an answer. It was all too complicated, even for him. He didn't even know where to start. He suddenly felt the strong urge to see his father again, to see his mother, his uncle, his Aina. He felt lost, his previous feelings of eagerness vanishing. Those words James spoke to him all those years ago, the same words Aina repeated without ever having heard them before. How right were they? Am I wrong? Lionel's soft whisper was like an eerie whistle in the wind, following the current and bouncing off the walls. There was no response. However, something still seemed to echo in Lionel's ears. A king? What a joke. Your old man's still alive. At best, you can be a little prince. The words echoed again and again like a flickering candlelight in Lionel's mind. Snap. The sound shook the estate, the skies above rumbling with thunder. But Lionel didn't even notice. It was as though everyone in the world was shaken but him. He only felt that his thoughts ran faster and his ability index seemed to have improved again, but he felt that that was only because he had just stepped into Tier 7. He didn't have an answer, but he still had a path. No one would stop him from getting out of here. 1 month. In 1 month no one here would be able to stop him. Chapter 1526. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:33 and 55 seconds p.m. Chapter 1526. Stars. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel entered a state of unprecedented focus, his mind reaching a state of tranquility as he began to focus on what would most help to achieve his goal, the magic system of this world. The books were far more complex than Lionel had originally given them credit for. While they didn't store their information in pendants, the pages of their books held a special magical ability to hide and store more information than their dimensions would seem to allow. For the more complex books, it wasn't surprising to get several normal books worth of information on just a single page or two. Regardless, the introduction of this world's magic system was fairly simple, or overly complex depending on how you looked at it. If Lionel had to describe it in just a few words, it was as though all of the most important branches of power systems in the dimensional verse had been combined into a singular discipline. Quite frankly, if it wasn't because Lionel was so focused, he just might gasp in amazement. The magic or power system of this world was predicated on stars. And these stars were designed with the constellation realm of the universal cycles in mind. From birth, the people of this world were innately born from anywhere from 0 to 3 stars. In truth, these weren't true stars but could be considered a precursor. These stars would be very small and immature. Depending on several factors, these stars would also dictate everything about your talent. Those who could not use the force of this world were usually born with 0 stars. When Lionel thought to this point, he obviously couldn't help but turn his mind toward dimensional cleanse. Could this be the reason he could use his force here while the others could not? Lionel had no real way of knowing if this was true or not, but what he did know was that the formation of stars in this world beyond birth required much more effort than what he had put in. If it was really because of dimensional cleanse, it just didn't seem to make sense. If the stars of dimensional cleanse and the stars of this world were equivalent in function and nature, then shouldn't he be a powerhouse? He already had 8 stars, how could the likes of Mistress Olidark possibly match him? In addition, the formation of stars in this world was reliant on a complex step-by-step process. By the nature of things in this place, you could only form 1 star for every 9 tiers you climbed. Well, for every set of tiers, that is. In this world, it actually depended. In this world, you have the right to practice in force only if you were born with at least 1 star. Only then would you have the chance to form a second and third and truly begin on your journey. And it was only upon forming your 3rd star that you could begin to try and enter this world's 4th dimensional equivalent. This meant one very obvious thing: the hunters that Lionel had met when he first entered this world weren't even 4th dimensional existences. He couldn't fathom the fact that this was true, so he hadn't even been able to see through this. From this point, once your 3rd star was formed, you could begin to grow and nurture your stars via the formation of your force nodes. In this way, this process worked exactly like it had when Lionel was in the 3rd dimension. In fact, the 4th dimension and 5th dimension worked exactly the same ways as well. In the 3rd star, one would form their nodes. With every node formation, the more compatible the location was with you, the higher resonance it would have with your stars, and the more growth it would have. The size of your node and the location were the greatest factors, just like in the dimensional verse. So long as your node was large and compatible, your stars would resonate and grow. The formation of each node would start a new resonance and growth period. Once this period ended, you could then form your next node. Just like in the dimensional verse as well, many couldn't form all 9 of their nodes and wouldn't gain the benefit of 9 resonances. As such, the stars would remain in a more infant-like state for longer before reaching maturity and beginning to display their true strength. This process would repeat in the 4th dimension, but with the addition of a 4th star. This time, as you formed your nodal pathways, your stars would resonate and grow. And then again in the 5th dimension, or rather the 5th star. Every time you unshackled your mind to a new tier, your stars would resonate, and they would grow in strength. Finally, you would be standing before the 6th dimension, and here was where everything would change and the fascinating aspects of this power system would begin to manifest itself. In this world, the 4 seasons realm did not exist. In addition, the heavenly body, natural light, cosmos, and constellation realms took on a new form entirely. Lionel couldn't begin to understand why this was, but what he did know was that the people of this world built everything on the backs of their stars. As one might have guessed by this point, the constellation of the constellation realm, the ultimate level sought after by all, would be formed by the stars within your body itself. The power of such a thing was unimaginable. It was no longer an illusion, but rather a tangible representation of might stored within the walls of your body. The difference was akin to night and day. But this wasn't just the case for the constellation realm, this would continue to be true for each and every realm. There was no God path or convention path in this world, or rather, they didn't appear in the same form. Rather, the two seemed to combine into a new discipline that revolved around stars. Chapter 1527. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:33 and 54 seconds p.m. Chapter 1527. Final hurdle: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. How was it that the magic system accomplished this? It was actually quite simple. Once a star reached maturity, it could begin to be projected outward in a show of strength and power. The existence of a star was like having a nuclear plant at the core of your body. The amount of energy it could pull in and suck toward itself from the outside world was immense, and its ability to do so would only grow as you nurtured it past maturity into an untouched, elite state. Before a star ever became part of your constellation, you could, just like in the God path, use it as a medium to manifest God runes. In this world, however, these were called star runes. This was the extent to which Lionel understood the God path of the dimensional verse, for he couldn't draw any more comparisons than that. But it was still enough for him to paint a picture and understand what was going on. Upon entering the sixth star in this world, you could finally begin to comprehend the heavenly body realm. Upon doing so and forming your own path, you are thus able to manifest your stars. Of course, the number of stars you could manifest was based on a number of factors. Whether they were mature or not was one matter, but another was the limit of your talent and comprehension. Some could only sustain one star while others could sustain all of theirs. Those that could do the latter were definitely the pinnacle of talents in this world. In truth, it was quite average to only be capable of manifesting one star. In fact, this was downplaying it. If you could manifest one star at the sixth dimension, you were considered a genius. If you only unlocked and gained the ability to manifest one more for every dimension you climbed, you would be able to maintain your stamp as a genius. Those that could manifest two were shocking, while those that could manifest three or more were mostly unheard of. These numbers would all tick up by one for every step forward in strength a person took and for every realm they crossed. In this world, the natural light realm was also different. It represented a state your stars could enter where the skies would darken and the only light that remained was them. It would feel as though night had been cast upon the land before it was blessed with the day once more. This was the representation of the monstrosity of power a seventh star held. It was as though they could dictate the laws themselves. Upon reaching the cosmos realm, the phenomena would become even more exaggerated. One star would break apart and form many small motes of light, dotting the skies across and blanketing a battlefield. It was a sight that one would need to see to believe. The process of entering the constellation realm was a reformation of your stars into 9 cores. These 9 cores and their orbiters would take form to become your constellation. These so-called orbiters were pieces of your stars that you failed to bring back together. The closer to the number 9 your constellation was, the more powerful it was. These were all things far beyond Lionel and he had no business thinking about them, but he was in a bind. He thought that by reading through the materials of the oligarchs, he would be able to find the method to break into the God path. After all, if this was a zone, the system should be similar enough. In fact, since it was a mythological zone, it should be even better. This would mean that Lionel would have an even better magic system to take advantage of. But the main issue here was that, well, there were several. For one, he already had 8 stars. How exactly was he going to form his 6th, exactly? Didn't he already pass that by? Also, if it was the case that dimensional cleanse wasn't related to this world at all and he was being ridiculous, wasn't that even worse? That meant he had no stars at all and the minimum requirement for beginning in any method was to have at least 1. Stars were able to harness and quickly gather energy, but if you had no stars, then there was nothing to gather energy for you. All of the methods that Lionel had memorized from the oligarch family followed this line of logic as well. And their methods of breaking into the 6th star required him to resonate his 5 stars to catalyze the birth of a new one. No matter how you looked at it, there was nothing but a blocked road ahead. However, at the moment, Lionel was unprecedentedly calm. He already knew what he would have to do. If he had to choose between this and the lives of the people he cared about, the answer was too obvious. He didn't even need to think about it. If dimensional cleanse was really the reason he could use force in this world, then that meant that his mother and Aina were especially helpless, not to mention his friends and brothers. Without his help, they would be helpless. He needed the strength to leave this place and the 5th dimension wouldn't give it to him. He needed to break into the 6th. Unfortunately, he didn't have the method to enter the God path, so there was only one choice. He would enter the 6th dimension through the conventional path. Once Lionel made his decision, he did not hesitate. For the first time in a long time, he brought forward the natural force art of the dimensional cleanse. Until now, he had been relying on his innate node to break the shackles of his mind and had never needed to use it, but it was about time he brought it forward. Before losing to Amory, Lionel passed 3 rounds of the trials, so in his mind currently, he had the 5th dimensional layer and the 6th dimensional layer of dimensional cleanse. He would use the former to reach the peak of the 5th star as quickly as possible, and then use the latter to break through the final hurdle. Chapter 1528. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:33 and 52 seconds p.m. Chapter 1528. Neither if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The visualization of the 5th dimensional layer of dimensional cleanse used to overwhelm Lionel, but now it didn't feel like so any longer. He felt that it would only take him about a single week to not only grasp it, but to fully comprehend this layer like he had done with the 4th dimensional layer. In this way, he would be able to pass it along to others. Lionel took this ability to pass on dimensional cleanse more importantly than ever now that he felt it might be related to his current freedom in this world. After a glance at it, Lionel hesitated. This wasn't because he felt that he had chosen wrong, but rather because he wasn't sure what would happen if he suddenly began to practice now. What Lionel didn't know is that the commotion caused earlier by the sudden snap had whisked away all the experts of the oligarch family. It wasn't just them, but a high-level meeting the likes of which hadn't occurred in tens of thousands of years was called. The last time such a meeting was called, it was due to the descent of a chaos demon. This was how rare such an event was, and for those people to send down such an order. All those of the 7th star and above were forced to acknowledge the call. The only ones that remained to monitor the home were the 6 stars of the oligarch family. Unbeknownst to him, Lionel had given himself his own lucky chance. But had he been aware, he might have had far too many questions to ever think of focusing. In the end, Lionel shook his head. It didn't make sense for him to bother trying to hide his activities. This was his bed, he had to lie in it. He didn't believe his skill was high enough to draw a force art capable of concealing what he was doing. Well, he might have had the skill, but he was lacking in the necessary power. Let them watch, then. Don't choke. A cold light flickered in Lionel's gaze and he focused once more. The complex, spherical gear system of the natural force art visualization reflected in his mind and even appeared in his irises. It felt like it could calculate all the variables of the world with a single input, a machine of strokes, gears, and pipes so enormous that there was nothing it couldn't accomplish. However, this complex machine became like nothing more than a pile of individual parts to Lionel. Without even meditating upon it a single time, it was as though he could dissect it and put it all back together. Lionel's millions of minds took each one of these pieces as their own and then began to comprehend them simultaneously. Wang. At that moment, Lionel re-established himself in Tier 1 of the 5th dimension, grasping the essence of the visualization to that level in just a few minutes, not even a set of 10 of which had passed. Lionel's stars reacted fiercely, their rotation speed increasing by several folds and their sizes increasing explosively. Lionel was caught so off guard that he could only watch in silence as large amounts of force surged toward him like a tide. The silver stars, now constructed of dream force, were like a dried ocean bed finally receiving a heavy rain. They glowed such a bright light that even though they were within Lionel's own mind, he felt like he couldn't even look at them properly. The blue stars, charged of raging vital star force, became like greedy tornadoes, forcing large amounts of vital star force, that should have been a rare energy, through the nodal pathways in Lionel's body, through his spine, into the node of his brainstem, charging through his brain and into his ethereal glabella. And then there were the fierce red-gold stars. Strands of scarlet star force that Lionel had struggled to budge and move gathered in such thick quantities that they manifested in the air like threads of gorgeous silk. Despite following the same path the dream force and vital star force had, Lionel didn't feel any pain at all. In fact, it was as though he had been refreshed, his innate nodes even glowing with a fiercer light. Right then, it was as though the whole oligarch estate was quaking. Lionel continued to watch this scene, not quite understanding what was happening. According to what he knew, dimensional cleanse was a special take that could be practiced alongside other ones. However, there shouldn't have been such a large difference here. At the very least, you shouldn't benefit as though you were truly breaking into the same realm twice. If things were like that, then everyone would insist on practicing dimensional cleanse, no matter what. This was why Lionel had never really stressed about using the visualization to break through. In fact, using his innate node to break through was more beneficial for him in the long run, and he could always use the visualization later. Somehow, though, this singular breakthrough still felt like an enormous watershed. Lionel could only ignore it. He was still worried about being interrupted, so he wanted to gain as much as he could before others insisted on interfering. However, what he hadn't known was that the force was so violent and dense that no one dared to get close. Or, more accurately, anyone who would have dared wasn't present to begin with. In this world, atmospheric force wasn't just more difficult to control, but when it appeared in large concentrations, it was dangerous for those that followed the star path, especially if the force followed a path that they did not. Lionel blazed through the fifth dimension once more. By the third day, he had already stepped into Tier 6, by the fourth, Tier 7. By the fifth, he broke through once again, finally entering Tier 8. And, exactly 1 week later, just like he planned, he sat at the border of Tier 9, ready to break the final veil and form his 9th star. However, at that moment, Lionel paused. There was a secret here he knew he hadn't quite grasped, but there was also an opportunity. Lionel took a breath, a roar leaving his lips. At that moment, the sound of a final shattering barrier resounded and the 9th star began to form in Lionel's mind. However, there wasn't one star core, there were two. And neither of them were red gold. Chapter 1529. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:33 and 51 seconds p.m. Chapter 1529. Fusion. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. If there was anything Lionel knew how to do, it was to take advantage of a situation. Whether it was in his daily life or even his battle style, everything was predicated on capitalizing on a moment of opportunity, a moment of weakness, or even a moment of enlightenment. Over the last week, Lionel felt like his mind was constantly getting refreshed and constantly strengthening. Not only had it allowed him to stay awake and not rest a single time, but it also made him sharper and faster, his mind growing even more powerful than it had been before. No, it was more like his mind was finally gaining the proper fuel, blessed with a refreshing amount and quality of force it had never experienced before. As the dream force surged in, Lionel felt that his base starry spirit domain was slowly growing millimeter by millimeter. At the same time, as his vital star force stars rumbled with life, the feeling of vitality coursing through his veins was absolutely intoxicating. It was as though someone was pouring the purest ambrosia of the gods into his heart, allowing every pump to send it throughout his body. His lifespan was quickly expanding, but better yet, his healing factor seemed to have grown supercharged. As though this wasn't enough, his star fusion, self-created technique, one he rarely used due to all its limitations, seemed to grow endlessly powerful. Lionel couldn't even spare the mental power to think about the implications of such a change. The time it would take to recharge his star fusion technique might not even be a fraction of what it once was. In fact, it even seemed that he might not have to wait for it to recharge at all. Of all of these stars, though, the most special was without a doubt Lionel's Scarlet Star Force twin stars. When they began absorbing the Scarlet Star Force toward them, filling themselves up like someone who had suffered through a famine, its changes were far more profound than Lionel's other stars. Not only did it feel as though its growth capacity was far beyond that of his other stars, Lionel also watched in awe as it began to quickly form its own runes. One after another, they manifested in the large mass of swirling, hot, red gold gas. Lionel didn't need to think much to be certain that these must be star runes as opposed to the god runes of the dimensional verse. Unlike others who didn't have innate node, Lionel's star runes formed automatically based on his comprehended innate node. Not only that, but because they were the truest and most natural form of destruction runes, they were far beyond anything the comprehension a living creature could possibly form. How could a person match up to the genius of the evolution of the world at large? After countless trillions of years of trial and order, the perfect and final state of these star runes were finally created, and now they formed under the control of Lionel, radiating out with such violent energies that Lionel's bed crumbled to ashes despite him not releasing them, his bedroom's floors and walls beginning to grow with cracks. The entire process couldn't have been more magical or any more mystical. Lionel had never felt the presence of his innate node, or rather innate nodes, so clearly. It was as though they were muffled and yelling for his attention previously, only for their roars to finally reach his ears now. At that moment, new destruction runes quickly formed in Lionel's eyes. His eyelids glowed with a blinding red-gold light, barely holding them back. Lionel had already comprehended 729 destruction runes, but that couldn't even be said to have been under his own effort. It had happened while he was unconscious. But this time, he couldn't have been more conscious. In fact, he experienced every bit of this magical feeling. From 729, he crossed 1,000, then 2,000. With every set of 9 that formed, they would combine. With every set of 81 they would combine one more. With every set of 729, they would combine once again, dancing in Lionel's irises and becoming more and more profound with every passing second. The estate quaked uncontrollably. The overload of destruction runes would have shattered the foundation of any other location in the city. But the Olidark estate was the most fortified location there was outside of the city walls themselves. Lionel's heart pumped with wild abandon. His destruction rune formation caused such a commotion that it was hard to pay attention to just what was happening to the other parts of his body. But those changes were just as profound even though they had far more room to grow. As the dream force pumped throughout him, Lionel felt that his mind was growing stronger. It wasn't just his internal sight and starry spirit domain, it was something deeper, as though even his lineage factors themselves were being fueled and evolved. His spear domain lineage factor, predominantly located in his mind, seemed to expand and become more complex. His king's might flourished, the small violet humanoid figure that used to be its form growing larger and more detailed. It formed its own armor, holding a bow in one hand and a spear in the other. It stood valiantly in the recesses of Lionel's mind, brimming with fighting will. His starry-tailed fox lineage factor's wisdom branch flourished, the boundaries of his mind becoming sturdier and its expanse became wider. Somehow, these breakthroughs were pushing the boundaries of already defined limits to lineage factors that had always been with Lionel. But that was just what Dream Force had done. When the vital star force got a hold of Lionel, the changes to his mind began to fuse with the now coming changes to his body. It was as though everything was coming together as one, leaving no stone unturned and forming a perfect and whole product. Lionel's body was put under the constant pressure of evolution, his strengths fusing together into a whole that the former version of himself couldn't hope to compare to. You're tuning in to the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.